The Legions of Athena, Chapter 1. The kingdom of Minerva was regarded as the intellectual capital of the world and is one of the 12 great Olympian kingdoms, the country which respects knowledge and science above all else. It was ruled by the goddess of wisdom, Athena. She was a wise and just ruler who, due to her tactical brilliance in the battlefield, earned the title of the goddess of war. She ruled from the capital city of Athens, located in the center of the nation. The capital housed such advanced technology that Athens was called the future city by many. The city of Athens was a real beauty to behold as well. It was a well-planned city with a very structured feel to it. From an aerial view, the city was laid out in the shape of a flower with 5 petals. Each of the petals held a different part of the city, namely the residential area, the military barracks, the industrial area, the entertainment area, and the research and development unit. Each of these sectors had large and oddly shaped buildings, usually increasing in size as they approached the central area. In addition to this, the entire city was encased in a large energy barrier called the Attack-Enabled Giga-Ion Shield, known commonly as Aegis. Thus, it appeared as if the city was encased in a giant snow globe. The central area of the flower-patterned city was home to the great castle of Athena, the Owl's Nest. The castle was large and silver with tall towers that ended in inverted cones surrounding it. Each of the towers looked like large spears aimed at the sky and enclosed the main dome-roofed structure of the castle. Maximus awoke in one of the smaller towers, in the western part of the castle. It had been 2 weeks since Maximus and his rather unorthodox crew had arrived at Athens, after being chased out of his own country Mars. Maximus and his friends finally managed to find refuge in Athens, and right now it was the safest place they could be. Mars and Minerva had been at war for the previous half-decade. In the 5 years of war, Athens had never been breached. This was not due to lack of trying either. Ares, the god of war and ruler of Mars, had left no stone unturned. Thus, after being chased across 2 countries by Ares' soldiers and even his personal champion, any place they couldn't infiltrate was great for Maximus and his companions. His companions, team, friends, Maximus really didn't know what to call the motley group that had accompanied him on the arduous journey to this city. 2 of them were like him, chased out of Mars, his closest friends, Rex and Hedger. Then there was the world-famous inventor Daedalus, who was also one of Athena's personal advisors, and the reason behind the warm welcome accorded to them at Athens. Finally, the man who was probably the only reason they all managed to survive till Athens in the first place, the legendary warrior Achilles. But Maximus hadn't seen any of them apart from Hedger since a few days. Rex had been pretty badly hurt when they got here. He was still in the infirmary wing of the castle, where Maximus and Hedger were not allowed to go. Achilles, on the other hand, was not in the city anymore. Just 2 days after their arrival, he had left again citing something that needed his attention, and he hadn't returned yet. Daedalus visited occasionally, but he was a busy man. A lot of work seemed to have piled up during his absence from the city, and that needed to be taken care of. Hence, it had been days since his last visit as well. That accounted for everyone, well, almost. There was one more member who had made it to Athens, Mia. Mia had joined their group midway because she really wanted to reach Athens for her own reasons. But Maximus hadn't seen her since the day they had reached here. Even though they had stuck together on the basis of mutual convenience, he really thought they had become friends by the end of the journey. Now Maximus had his doubts, since she had not been to visit him or Hedger even once in the West Tower. The West Tower was one of the smaller towers in the Owl's Nest, obviously positioned in the west side of the castle. It was one of the towers in the castle that was reserved for special guests, Daedalus had informed them. At the time, though, Maximus had no idea that special guest meant prisoner. Even though this wasn't completely true, imprisoned was exactly how he felt like here. This was mainly due to the fact that neither he nor Hedger was allowed to leave the tower at any cost. Daedalus had already apologized repeatedly for this, but the matter was out of his hands. The fact remained that they were still citizens of Mars, a country at war with their current hosts. Therefore, they could not be completely trusted, no matter what Daedalus's personal feelings were. Maximus pushed all this to the back of his mind as he finally pulled himself out of bed. The room he was in was pretty small and very plain. There was really nothing in it, only a bed and a small table in the corner. Everything inside, from the carpets to the curtains, was a monotonous shade of dull white. He felt like he was in a hospital instead of a guest room of a palace. The room also had a computer mounted on the wall. This controlled everything inside the room, like the lights and temperature. It could also send and receive messages from other rooms in the castle. He managed to make it to the bathroom and wash his face, finally rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. He looked at himself in the mirror and his dark eyes stared back at him. His hair was black, and he kept it short. It had been that way ever since he was in the Martian army, and he hadn't changed it since. His body was lean and muscular, which worked well for him as he specialized in sword and shield combat, though he no longer had a shield. He freshened up and decided to step out with his sword. As he approached the door to leave his room, the door opened on its own. That seemed to be how everything worked in Athens, automatically. The West Tower had 4 floors and everything could be done at the touch of a button in there. The floor he was standing on had numerous rooms identical to the one he occupied. Hedger's room was right next to his, but he didn't bother going there. It was still really early and he knew that his friend would still be sleeping. Instead, he went via the elevator to one of the other 3 floors, which included a dining area, a library, and a recreational room respectively. Maximus got down at the recreational room, a room meant to entertain the guests who stayed in the West Tower. It had a bunch of ordinary games in it, such as chess, caroms, and even a billiards table. Then it had a wide array of virtual gaming systems that were so high-end that he had never even seen them earlier. Of these, Maximus had really grown fond of one in particular, the virtual arena. Even though it was technically a game, it was in fact an advanced form of training. It consisted of a large square stage, which was filled with motion sensors or something of the sort. Maximus wasn't sure. A pair of opaque glasses were provided for the user to wear. When the game was activated, the user was transported to another world. It was like actually standing in a desert or forest or whatever else the backdrop was. If the user held a weapon, in his case a sword, a similar weapon would be mimicked in the virtual world. This meant that the game was as good as sparring with a real person. The game itself was pretty straightforward. In each level, the player would be faced an array of enemies with increasing levels of difficulty as the stages progressed. The game could be played by up to 4 players. Maximus had played it a few times with Hedger, but anything with too much physical labor was not Hedger's idea of fun, so Maximus usually played it before Hedger woke up. For Maximus, it felt more like an interesting form of training, but right now he was stuck at a particular level. Maximus went ahead and powered up the system. Then he drew his sword and entered the virtual arena. The scenery shifted to the familiar scenario of level 7, the icy plains. All he could see around him was ice and snow. Though he couldn't feel the bitter chill, the details were excellent. He could even make out the silhouettes of snowy mountains in the edges. He looked at himself to see his now familiar virtual armor. It looked like any standard military armor, complete with a helmet and a visor that covered the face. His sword also looked different, but it was still the same size. Also, a health bar appeared in the top corner of his visor. He was checking if the game mechanics were working properly when he heard the sound of a loud horn. This was the signal for the game to begin. Soon they came into sight. The enemies of level 7. They were called ice monkeys, and they appeared exactly what they sounded like. Giant blue monkeys with 2 tails and an armor made of ice. They also held icicles in their hands, which they used as spears. Their tails that were shaped into thick ice were used for attacking as well. Maximus wasn't too worried though. They were tough enemies, but he was confident he could handle them. The only reason he still hadn't cleared this stage was because of the level boss. Each level had a boss at the climax, who was much harder than the regular enemies. Maximus was sure that he would make it to the boss, but he was wary of the ice monkeys and didn't take them too lightly, since they could still reduce his health bar, which in turn would put him at a disadvantage when he would have to battle the boss. The ice monkeys began to attack. Maximus dodged and countered with ease. He was a pretty good swordsman. He had held his first sword at the age of 12 when he was first drafted in for training by the army. He had been using one ever since, but his swordsmanship had greatly improved since he had left Mars, and he had Achilles to thank for that. The great warrior had been tutoring him for a while now. The improvements were astonishing. It also helped that he had a pretty high-quality energy blade now as well, but he was still unsure if the blade should be counted as a blessing, and he had his own reasons for the same. The monkeys weren't too fast. The only real advantage they had were their numbers. But even so, their attacks were repetitive, and Maximus had already gotten used to their attack patterns. He dealt with the first wave without even taking a single hit. He was confident he could keep it that way till the boss, but it didn't go as planned. One of the monkeys had jabbed him on the shoulder. Yet another whacked him with its tail a couple of times. His health bar reduced, but luckily he didn't have to feel the pain. Soon enough, he was up against the final wave, which he managed to tackle successfully. As the last of the ice monkeys fell, he still had more than 75% of his health bar left. With the final wave beaten, he had a few seconds to catch his breath. The enemies may not have been real, but the effort his body had to put into the fights was. An entrance to a cave appeared. Maximus readied himself for what was to follow. Within moments, the ground began to shake, and a huge beast emerged from the cave. It was time for the boss battle. Looming before him, nearly 9 foot tall, was a huge gorilla, aptly named the Arctic gorilla. The beast towered over him easily, and its arms alone were longer than his body. It was also blue in color like the monkeys, and wore a similar armor as well. It had a spiky mohawk made of ice atop its head. If this was in the real world, Max's first instinct would have been to flee, but this was just a game. Moreover, he had already fought this boss 4 times earlier, and lost 4 times, he reminded himself. The battle began as the oversized primate charged at him. Max managed to dodge him. The beast didn't have any weapons, and it didn't need any either. Its arms alone were enough to send a person flying. But this didn't happen in the game. When an enemy touched the player's body, they didn't move at all. Instead, the life bar just dropped. This was what happened a few seconds later, when the gorilla smashed Maximus on the head. Soon it was a full-on battle. Max managed to get more blows on the beast than he received, but the drawback was that each of his attacks did only about 1/4 of the damage of that done by the gorilla. With a shot to his left shoulder, Max's health bar had reached the final 10%, while the beast still had over half of its health left. Knowing that he was about to lose again, he charged straight for the gorilla's head, his final desperate attempt at victory, as the beast smashed his chest with its fists, bringing the health bar down to 0. The virtual world began to dissolve around him with the words "Game Over" flashing in front of him. The Legions of Athena, Chapter 2. Maximus took off his virtual glasses and dropped it along with his sword. Then he sat on the ground, panting. "I take it from your face. The big monkey wiped the floor with you again." Max?" Someone pointed out from behind. Maximus didn't have to turn around to know who it was. It was a voice he would recognize in his sleep. It belonged to one of his best friends, Hedger. "You're up early. I mean, it's not even noon yet," Maximus retorted with a grin. "Well, forgive me for wanting to catch up on my beauty sleep," replied Hedger as he glided over Maximus. Hedger was a sprite, a race of creatures that only grew to about 3 to 4 feet. They had arms and legs similar to humans, but they also had a tail, which they mainly used to hang upside down while they slept. They had snouts and pointy ears, which made their heads look like that of a dog. But what really made a sprite special were its wings, 2 long wings that helped them fly short distances and glide. Sprites also came in a variety of colors, and Hedger was mostly green along with his wings. This implied his full name was Hedger Greenwing. Hedger helped Maximus get up to his feet again. "So why are you up early anyway?" Maximus asked. "It wasn't my idea, trust me," Hedger said. "Just got a call from Daedalus on this thing," he explained. He held up the cell phone and showed it to Maximus. The cell phones, or mobiles as they were called, were completely new technology to the two of them. Mobiles were a piece of technology available only in Minerva. The first time either of them had seen one was when Daedalus had given it to them when they moved into the West Tower. According to him, they could be used anywhere in Minerva, but not outside the country, because no other country had the towers that were essential to make them work. Thus, the rest of the world still depended on land phones and magical messages, but not Minerva. Minerva had always been decades ahead in technology. "So what did he want?" Maximus inquired. "No idea," Hedger replied. "When it began to ring, I threw it under the bed thinking it was the alarm. It took a few seconds for me to realize that I hadn't set an alarm. By the time I got up to answer it, the phone had stopped ringing." Maximus rolled his eyes as Hedger grinned sheepishly at him. "So why didn't you call him and find out?" Maximus asked. Hedger shifted around a bit and said, "Well, the phone did not exactly stop ringing on its own, you see." Maximus took the phone from him and examined it. "You broke it." "Kind of, yeah," Hedger admitted. "Oh, come on, Hedger, how could you?" Maximus yelled, half annoyed. "Hey, relax." Hedger tried to placate his friend. "I'm sure Daedalus can fix it. Besides, when he couldn't contact me on the phone, he sent a message to the computer in my room saying he will meet us later on today." "That's not the point," Maximus explained. "The point is you weren't supposed to break it in the first place. Have I told you how terribly sorry I am already?" Hedger replied sheepishly. Maximus decided to let it go. Daedalus could probably fix it in seconds. He could fix anything. Heck, he was considered to be the greatest inventor in the world. "Did the message say what he wanted?" Maximus asked. "Nope, just that he would meet us here for lunch." They headed down to the dining hall. After his little workout, Maximus was starving. The hall was a large, plain room with no furniture other than a long table in the center surrounded by chairs. The table had an equally long mechanical device running through its center, an omni-food processor, Daedalus had called it. Its mechanism was simple. When one sat on any of the chairs, it pushed out a plate of food towards you. But Maximus didn't know the operation of this piece of technology. However, it wasn't the functioning that bothered him, but the food it produced. For one thing, there was no choice regarding the kind of food. It just served whatever it liked. It had a menu preset for the week, and there was no way of changing it. As for what it served, it was by far the oddest kind of food they had ever seen. They had broadly classified it into 2 types, bricks and goop. Bricks were shaped exactly like its namesake, while the goop was a mushy, gooey substance that resembled porridge. Their colors and textures differed, but they all had one thing in common. They were equally bland and tasteless. Daedalus explained to them that the food served to them was a carefully calculated diet made for optimum nutrition. Those were his exact words. Unfortunately, it seemed the concept of taste never entered the calculations. The two of them sat down next to each other. Within seconds, the machine dished out 2 plates to them. "Hooray, yellow goop today," remarked Hedger said dryly. Maximus had to admit that this was not the kind of food he had expected at Athena's castle. After all, not long ago they had stayed at the smith god Hephaestus's castle where each meal was a feast. You know, for all the tech in this place, would it have killed them to install a vending machine somewhere? Hedger cribbed. Maximus nodded to this. "Yeah, I think I'm starting to forget what real food tastes like." But there was no point in complaining. More importantly, there wasn't anyone to complain to. Everything was taken care of by machines. They hadn't laid eyes on anyone other than Daedalus ever since they had moved into the tower. They ate their goop silently and got up to leave. As they did so, the machine sucked in the plates using a kind of vacuum, and the table was spotless again. So, we still got a few hours before Daedalus gets here. Want to go shoot some virtual skeletons? Hedger asked. But Maximus shook his head and said, Actually, I was considering heading to the library. Oh no, not again, Hedger groaned. Seriously, Maxie, that sword is turning into an obsession. He was talking about the sword which Maximus carried at the moment. Even a layman could see that the sword was of exceptional quality. It wasn't just the looks either. The blade was also an energy weapon. Such weapons, with the help of magic or technology, were capable of adding a special punch to it, sometimes literally. In Max's case, the blade was able to generate excess heat, which greatly increased its power. Needless to say, it was not something you expected to see in the hands of an army reject. But Maximus had found it in an old abandoned ruin. Now he was stuck with it, for better or for worse. Come on, I'm just curious about it, you know. It's not like we have anything better to do, Maximus countered. Please enlighten me how playing video games is not better than looking through dusty old books, Hedger replied. Maximus sighed, saying, You don't have to help me, you know. Oh no, I'll help. I'll whine the whole time, but I'll help, Hedger said. They headed to the library. As far as Hedger was concerned, they were just checking out the blade to discover more about it. But Maximus had a different reason. What Hedger didn't know was that along with the sword, he had also got something else in the bargain, a voice inside his head. The voice is what Maximus had finally decided to call the enigmatic entity that spoke to him in his dreams. When Maximus first found the blade, it had been sealed. It was the voice that had finally opened it. In exchange for letting him use the sword, the voice demanded Maximus to run a few errands for it. But it had been a while since they had last spoken. Maximus had no clue on how to contact it. The voice had also made it pretty clear that it would not reveal its identity. So what he was really hoping to find in the library was the original owner of the blade, which Maximus deduced was the voice. But so far, he had had no such luck. The library took up the entire top floor of the tower. It was a large room filled with over 24 huge bookshelves, each stacked with a wide array of books. It wasn't just books either. It also housed quite a few computers, which acted as digital libraries. The first few days Maximus was there, he had explored these computers, hoping to find something in the digital archives, but he drew a blank. He still hadn't given up hope, though. Daedalus had once told him that the markings on his hilt were pretty ancient. This meant that information on it was not to be expected in digital form. So now Maximus spent his time browsing through old books which had anything to do with weaponry, with the occasional help from Hedger. Find anything? Maximus asked, noticing his friend engrossed in reading a book attentively. About your sword, no, Hedger answered. But man, there are some wicked weapons out there. Listen to this, he continued. It says here that during the Great Titan War, the brothers of the Trinity were each given a weapon of immense power that ultimately shifted the tide of war in their favor. So, everyone knows that, said Maximus. The brothers the book was referring to were none other than Poseidon, Hades, and Zeus, the three most powerful gods alive. It was the triumvirate who ushered in the new age after they had defeated their father in the Great Titan War. But this is where things get interesting. It says here while Zeus and Poseidon received weapons, Hades received a helmet, Hedger described. Says here that the helmet made him completely undetectable. The night before the final battle, Hades sneaked into the Titan camp and destroyed all their weapons, greatly crippling their strength, which cost them the war. Well, they never taught us that in the orphanage, Max said. He remembered the time he had spent in the orphanage, where every Sunday they had a class on divine history. It mainly covered all the deeds the gods had done. Now that he thought about it, there were many tales about the exploits of Zeus and the Olympian gods. Even Poseidon was often mentioned. But never Hades. Hedger continued nodding. That's why I thought it was interesting. It's not just that. I've been scanning through this book. Many facts in it are very different from what we know. Maximus took the book from him to check it out. The book was pretty big and probably had at least 1,000 pages. It was also old. So old in fact that it seemed to be made of parchments and was handwritten. How come it doesn't have a title? He asked. Don't know. But it appears to me that it was someone's personal journal of some sort, Hedger said. The author has signed it in certain places, but I can't make out the name. Maximus returned it and went ahead to check on his own set of books. Hedger kept reading the untitled one. After a while of finding nothing useful, Maximus decided it was time to leave since Daedalus would arrive soon. He got up and was surprised to see Hedger not move. He was still immersed in that book. Hey, Hedge, you coming or what? Maximus inquired. You go on ahead. I'll catch up, he replied. Well, this was a first, Maximus thought. Usually it was Hedger who was eager to leave the library, after having complained loudly about having to be there in the first place. All right. Just don't take long. Daedalus will arrive soon, Maximus said. Hedger nodded absent-mindedly. Maximus headed back to his room. He wanted to change his clothes before Daedalus came. Not that anyone would notice. Their rooms had been already stocked with some clothes when they arrived. All of them were exactly the same. Gray t-shirts with matching gray sweatpants. They were provided with 4 pairs of these identical clothes. They fit perfectly and were comfortable too, but they felt so dull. Seriously, Athens had to learn there existed more colors than white and gray in this world, Maximus thought to himself. After a brief visit to his room, Maximus headed to the dining hall. As he opened the doors to the place, he saw that Daedalus was already there, with his gray hair neatly combed and wearing a suede suit. He wasn't alone, though. Towering next to him was a huge minotaur with a bionic arm and a metal eye that rotated into focus along with his regular one as he saw him, Rex. "Look who finally decided to show up," Maximus said as he greeted his friend with a half-hug. Rex grinned at him and said, "Trust me, I would have come sooner if the docs here just let me. I was fine in a couple of days." "Correction, you regained your consciousness in a couple of days," Daedalus said. "Yeah, well, I felt fine when I got up," Rex mumbled. But Maximus knew better. His friend wasn't the type to whine about injuries. "I'm sure you were," Maximus said, "but I'm glad you stayed there just in case. We wouldn't want to cause any unnecessary trouble." Rex snorted and said, "Speaking of unnecessary trouble, where's Hedger?" "Oh, he must still be in the library," was Maximus' reply. Rex had a confused look on his face. "We are talking about the same Hedger, right? Short, green-winged, annoying?" "Yep," Max said. "Well then what the heck is he doing in a library?" Rex asked, baffled. "He found an interesting book, it seems," Maximus replied matter-of-factly. "Well, the castle libraries do house an extended variety of literary marvels," Daedalus opined. Maximus nodded, saying, "Yeah, you should check it out, Rex. It's huge." Daedalus chuckled at this. "My dear boy, this castle houses over 12 separate libraries, and the one in West Tower is among the smallest. Though I agree that the libraries are a sight to behold, we do not have time for it right now. We have to get going." "Where to?" Maximus queried. "To the banquet hall, of course," Daedalus replied. "A feast has been organized to celebrate the return of Achilles." "Wait, Achilles is back?" Maximus asked. "Yes, he got in this morning and is currently resting," Daedalus said. "He had left so hastily after our arrival. Empress Athena has arranged a banquet in his honor for rescuing me and for other services he has done for the country. Oh, and don't worry, I have mentioned all your contributions on the trip as well." Maximus understood this. Daedalus was not only a great inventor, but also one of Athena's advisors, so saving him from Ares was something that deserved honoring, but there was just one problem. "Won't that be hard, considering the fact that everyone thinks that Achilles is dead?" Maximus asked. "Ah, a clever question indeed, Maximus," Daedalus said. "But this is not the first time Achilles has helped out Minerva, and Empress Athena is well aware of the facts. So are most of the top officials. Besides, it's not like he tries to hide it too much. After our final battle, I am certain even Ares knows. So this banquet will have a lot of you top dogs then, including the champion?" Rex asked. Daedalus shook his head. "No, he is too busy at the front lines to make it, so there's no need to worry." Maximus had nearly forgotten about Rex and Minerva's champion. A champion was a post given to one particular warrior in each country. They were not officially part of the army, and only answered to their god or goddess. They acted as a personal warrior to the god they served. Minerva's champion had a bit of history with Rex, as he was the one responsible for decapitating his left side in the first place. They all stood there in an awkward silence. This was not a topic Rex liked to discuss, but luckily they were saved as the doors opened and Hedger glided in. "I thought I smelled something ugly on my way here," Hedger quipped with a grin at Rex. "How can you smell ugliness?" Rex asked. "Would you just take the insult and shut up?" Hedger bantered with his tongue out. Maximus wasn't surprised at Hedger's behavior. It was the way he was. But he knew Hedger was really glad to have Rex back. "Well, it looks like everyone's here. Then shall we carry on to the banquet?" suggested Daedalus. "Banquet?" Hedger asked. "What banquet?" "It seems Achilles is back and the queen is throwing him a banquet," Maximus explained. "We have to go now? I mean, I'm not dressed for that," Hedger exclaimed. He was right about that. He too was wearing the same gray-colored clothes that Maximus was wearing. "Well, we have no time for that. I mean, the banquet itself is tonight, but I've been asked to help coordinate it," Daedalus said. "I tried to tell you earlier, but I couldn't get you on the phone," he added. "Well, if there's no time, we'd better hurry," Hedger said, quickly changing the subject. They proceeded to the hall. For the first time in weeks, they finally stepped out of the West Tower. As they walked to the banquet hall, Hedger moved forward to have a private talk with Daedalus about the broken phone while Maximus and Rex trailed behind. After a while, Rex asked, "By the way, where's Mia? I thought she would be with you guys." Maximus shrugged his shoulders, indicating he didn't know. "No idea. The last I saw her was on the day we got here. I haven't heard from her since," Maximus said. "Well, that's a bit odd. Maybe she'll be at the banquet," Rex guessed. Maximus nodded in agreement. They entered a huge hall, which Daedalus showed them into. Maximus didn't know what to expect inside. It turned out there was nothing to imagine, as the entire hall was empty. It was a really big, dome-shaped room, but it had absolutely nothing in it, not even a chair to sit on. "Well, this is roomy," Hedger commented. There were a few people inside, though, around 11 in total. As they entered, one of them came towards them, to greet them, or at least to greet Daedalus. He was a man well into his 40s with a receding hairline and a potbelly. He also wore silver robes, which matched identical to those worn by few others in the room. "Ah, High Counselor Daedalus. So nice of you to join us," the man said with a very broad smile. "Dalton, I take it all the preparations have been taken care of," Daedalus replied. "Oh yes, High Counselor. We just need you to finalize the number of people for the afternoon," Dalton said. "Well, there will be 32 in all, including myself," he replied. "Very well then, sir," Dalton said. Then he turned to face the middle of the room, clapped his hands twice and shouted, "32." At these words, something huge and circular began to rise from the middle of the room. When it came out completely, Maximus realized it was a huge round table. Once the table was affixed, the wall on the left of the hall opened, and no less than 32 chairs rolled out automatically and arranged themselves around the table. Then they were attached to the floor and were immovable. All the chairs looked similar, except for one placed at the head of the table. This one was a bit bigger and a lot more decorated than the rest. On top of that chair was a small sculpture of an owl with its wings spread and an olive branch in its beak. Maximus guessed that the chair was reserved for the queen. "My dear High Counselor, if you would join me, I would like to discuss the menu for tonight as well," Dalton said. "Oh yes, of course," Daedalus said. He turned to the others and said, "Why don't you all just make yourself comfortable while I handle this?" Saying so, he moved ahead rapidly, closely followed by Dalton. But just as they were leaving, the man Dalton turned to them and gave them a look of pure dislike. Is it just me, or did that guy just give us the stinky?" Hedger murmured. Maximus nodded. "Yeah, I don't think he likes us," he agreed. Rex snorted at this and said, "By the gods, you're only getting that now." Both Hedger and Max looked at the Minotaur a bit confused. "Haven't you guys met anyone since you got here? I mean, like one of the locals?" Rex asked. They shook their heads and Hedger said, "Not really. I mean, we were stuck in that tower since day one and the only one who visited was Daedalus." "Ah, well, that explains it," Rex said, scratching his chin. "Well, then let me make it simple. They hate us. The whole damn country can't stand the sight of us. You know us being from Mars and all." Maximus was a bit surprised by this. They had been warned not to brag that they were from Mars, but it seems people found out anyway. "Trust me, there is going to be a lot more than dirty looks, guys," Rex continued. "Back in the hospital, most of them made it pretty clear that they didn't want me there." Maximus had a feeling Rex wasn't exaggerating. Around the room, the other people were glowering at them with disapproval and muttering under their breaths. He was starting to get a bit annoyed by this. Back in the trenches, they sometimes had travelers from Minerva, but he never remembered treating anyone like that. Then again, Mars had been at war with almost all its neighboring countries, so travelers from Minerva weren't particularly special to them. "I think I liked it better in that isolated tower," Maximus said. "Yeah, well, that seems to be part of the problem. It seems being a guest in the castle is a huge honor here. So, a lot of the people are offended that we are being allowed to stay here," Rex said. Hedger smirked at this. "Some honor. We've been eating nothing but bricks and goop for weeks. Send me back to the Vulcan capital any day." The hostile stares they received from every direction made them distinctly uncomfortable. More people started coming in, and none of them seemed too happy about their presence either. "I'm starting to think this was not such a good idea," Hedger said. "Bah, let them stare. It's all they do," Rex said. "Let's just go take a seat and wait for Daedalus." They walked towards the table and took seats next to each other. For some reason, the murmurs grew even louder, and it was starting to sound like a bee's nest. A few seconds after they had seated themselves, a person in armor came up to them and said, "What do you think you're doing?" It was evident from the voice that it was a woman. She wore a body armor that covered her completely. Even her face wasn't visible behind the helmet. Her tone clearly conveyed her fury. The armor itself was something Maximus had seen quite a few times before. It was the standard silver armor of the Minervian army. A long cavalier sword hung at her side. The three of them looked at each other hesitantly, not knowing to say, and did not meet her eyes. "Well, explain yourself," she commanded. "Last I heard, the likes of you weren't allowed out of the tower." The entire room was staring at them now. A few looked worried while others seemed to be nodding in agreement. Out of the crowd, a man walked towards them, an elf to be more precise. He had long silver hair and very pale skin, along with pointy ears. He was tall. All elves were usually a bit taller than humans. Maximus had seen elves before in the trenches, but they were not a very common race in Mars. But he had heard that Minerva was home to a high population of the race. "My lady," the elf said, "the Martians have been requested to join us at the banquet as our guests." "What?" shouted the lady, clearly outraged. "You expect me to dine with them? How am I supposed to hold down my food?" The crowd laughed at this, and a few of them cheered her on. "It is the Empress's wish," the elf said. The lady seemed to have no response to that. But then she turned back to the three of them and said, "That still does not give you the excuse to sit at the table before the queen has arrived. Do you think the rest of us are standing here because we are idiots, or are you openly disrespecting our queen?" Maximus was really starting to get annoyed by this person, but he knew better than to react. Instead, the three of them stood up. Hedger finally spoke up in the hope of calming things. "Listen, lady, we didn't know. See, we got up, no harm done," he said, flashing the best smile he could muster, but it wasn't enough. The lady pulled out her sword and grabbed Hedger by the collar and said, "I will decide if there is any harm done." Pam! The sound echoed through the hall as Rex had just tried to bring his bionic fist down on her face. But no avail. The lady had parried it with her blade. Things had gone sour real fast. All around them, the soldiers began drawing their swords and spears. Luckily, no one had brought any guns. Maximus had gone for his military knife, which he kept strapped inside his left shoe, but he really regretted not having his sword with him. "You dare attack me, you beast!" the lady screamed and charged at Rex. Maximus didn't know what to do. He couldn't just let this turn into a full-on battle. So he did the first thing that came into his head. He stuck his foot out in the lady's path. This worked out much more effectively than he had imagined, as the lady tripped and fell to the ground quite comically. The crowd was shocked to see this. There was a moment of dangerous silence in the room with all eyes watching the lady. She got up slowly, clearly humiliated by what had just happened. She unstrapped her helmet and threw it to the ground. She was glaring directly at Maximus with unbridled anger. Maximus, on the other hand, was surprised to see that the lady was definitely not old enough to be called a lady. She was a girl, probably around his age. Though her tone and posture was that of a much more mature woman, it was obvious now that she was young. Her hair was a pale blonde, her skin was a milky white, and she had big brown eyes, which would have been pretty if they were not so filled with rage at the moment. She started walking towards Maximus while muttering, "Why, you little piece of," with her sword ready to strike. "That's quite enough, Elisha," spoke a voice. Everyone turned to see that two men had just entered through the door. The man who spoke wore a light blue armor with silver edges. He had a matching blue battle helmet in his hand, and wore a long cape with Athena's symbol on it. His armor was also decorated with various medals. He looked like he was in his 40s, but Maximus was certain he was much older. He had handsome features coupled with a well-groomed black hair and beard, both of which were specked with strands of gray. His intelligent gray eyes were now discontentedly piercing through the girl called Elisha right now. "General Odysseus," Elisha said, quickly sheathing her sword. She moved forward to greet him and saluted him smartly. So did half of the people in the crowd, all of whom Maximus guessed were in Athena's army. But Odysseus was still not happy with this. He gave them all a cold stare and uttered, "Explain." No one was armed now. Everyone had put away their swords or retracted their spears. Minervian spears were not like ordinary ones. They could be retracted to half their size, which made them easier to carry. All the soldiers looked stone-faced now. Even the anger on Elisha's face had disappeared. "General, I only reacted in self-defense," she began to say. "You put a blade to his throat. How were we supposed to react?" Rex shouted, pointing at Hedger. Elisha opened her mouth to argue, but decided not to after seeing the look on Odysseus's face. "Now we are all here to enjoy a nice meal," Odysseus said in a calmer tone. "So I suggest you all behave yourself, especially in front of our guest of honor." He was talking, of course, about the man standing right next to him. He was also dressed in battle armor, only his was as black as midnight, and according to legend, it was invincible. Maximus had seen this legend tested on countless occasions and had to agree to its claim. The armor covered his entire body, except for his head and left leg, or at least where his left leg should have been. This man had lost it a long time ago, and now he had a bionic one fitted instead. So from the knee downwards, the man had a leg made completely of metal, but this made him no less competent on the battlefield. His face was rugged and handsome, with features that were as perfect as those seen on sculptures. His hair was black and worn in a military cut, though it seemed to have grown a bit lately. He did have a stubble growing like he hadn't shaved for days. The one thing that stood out was a scar he had above his right eye, but even that just enhanced his looks. It was easy to see why the crowd looked at this man with such admiration, respect, and even a bit of fear. After all, Achilles was a man who deserved all of it. "Well, now that we have that settled," Odysseus resumed, "I suggest we continue with our business till the goddess arrives." The crowd slowly started to disperse, congregating in small groups. Finally, the three of them found themselves with Odysseus, Achilles, and Elisha. Odysseus addressed the girl again, but this time in a much softer voice. "I expected better from you, Elisha." The girl looked at him, showing no signs of emotion. "I apologize, sir. I didn't mean to disappoint you." "Don't you think you're apologizing to the wrong person?" Odysseus asked. Elisha threw them a disgusted look. Turning to Odysseus, she said, "I will consider it. Excuse me, sir." With that, she turned and walked away. "Call me skeptical, but I don't think she's going to consider it," Hedger commented. Odysseus turned to them with a warm smile. "I apologize for that one. She's a brilliant student and a powerful warrior, but her interpersonal skills could use some tuning. Let's just hope we never have to see her after today," Maximus said. "But enough of that stuff. We're just glad to see you guys." Odysseus smiled at this while Achilles merely nodded. But Achilles was like that, as serious as they come. "So you guys doing okay here?" Achilles asked. "It's kind of cool, I guess." "But the food's nothing to brag about," Hedger replied. Then he turned to Odysseus and added, "No offense. Ah yes, the castle chefs are a bit too concerned about nutrition and not worried at all about our taste buds," Odysseus confided. "But I'm sure today's banquet will rectify that." "It's not the food that I'm worried about," Rex said dryly. All around the room, people were still giving them disapproving glances. The Legions of Athena. Chapter 3. About half an hour passed and the room was pretty full. It was obvious that the people gathered were all important. Most of them in armor did not wear ordinary ones. They wore special and decorated pieces with emblems and medals that signified their ranks. Those who were not in armor wore expensive suits or robes. The women wore designer clothes. There were a few who were dressed in regular armor though, including the girl Alicia. Maximus wondered why they were here. After all, ordinary soldiers didn't usually get to dine with queens. Odysseus had moved away to speak with some of the other guests. The three of them turned to Achilles. "So, where did you rush off to?" Maximus asked his trainer. "Had some things to take care of." "Not important," Achilles answered briefly. The others weren't surprised by this. Achilles was not the very talkative type, and this was his most polite way of saying it was none of their business. But still, Maximus was glad he was back. It was not only because he wanted to restart his training with him. Over the course of their trip, Achilles had almost become a leader of the group. After being chased out of their own country and being clearly unwelcome here, he was hoping Achilles might know what their next move should be. "So now that you're here, when do we leave?" Hedger asked. "As you may have noticed, the Minervians are as fond of us as a thorn in their leg." "Yes, I'm aware of the situation. I understand their sentiments too. I have nothing against Mars, but Ares is a man I detest," Achilles explained. "Trust me, we're not exactly his fans either," Maximus said. Achilles nodded. "I am aware of that, but sadly the people here may have a hard time believing it. However, I'll make sure that you get enough money and supplies to start a new life somewhere else before I leave." "What?" Maximus asked. "You're leaving again? Why?" "I try not to stay in the same place for too long. I'm supposed to be dead, remember?" he replied. "But everyone here seems to know you are alive though," Rex pointed out. Achilles shook his head in disagreement. "The only people who know are the ones gathered here and a few of Odysseus's trusted men. This is Athena's most inner circle. The common people have no idea that I'm still alive." This was true. Until a couple of months ago, Maximus had also thought that Achilles had been killed in the Great Trojan War, just like the rest of the world. "We could come with you," Maximus said. A small smile appeared on the great warrior's face. "I thank you for the offer. But a wanderer's life is not an easy one, and I attract more trouble than you know. No, it's best if you all restart your lives somewhere else, away from all this." Maximus opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, the main doors opened, and Daedalus came in with a man called Dalton. "Everyone to your seats, please," Dalton announced. "Her Empress Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the fair ruler of Minerva, has arrived. We'll talk later," said Achilles as he moved towards the table. The three of them followed him and took the seats to his left. Odysseus joined them too and sat on his right. Everyone stood at their seats, but no one sat down. As they had just understood, it was disrespectful to sit before the queen arrived. There was a mix of races around the table. They were mainly humans and elves, along with a few satyrs and exactly 3 centaurs. They all stood silently looking at the door, waiting for the queen. The main doors were opened by 2 very heavily armed guards. They cleared the way for a tall, lean woman. She walked into the room slowly, dressed in a flowing white and silver gown. Her light brown hair was tied in a bun and had a net covering it. Her face showed signs of age but had timeless beauty and grace. Her sharp eyes managed to look both calm and menacing at the same time. She had no jewelry on her, but she did have a pin on her chest with the owl and the olive branch, which was her symbol. Empress Athena gracefully walked into the room and took her seat without uttering a single word. Once she was seated, the others followed suit and took their seats, except the centaurs who didn't really use chairs, being half horse and all. The table was still really quiet, and everyone had their eyes fixed on the goddess. Athena looked around at the table and finally spoke. "A fine evening to all. It is with great pleasure that we are gathered here today, for we have a lot of reasons to be in high spirits. Not only do we have our High Counselor Daedalus back with us, but the siege on Fort Acropolis has also been lifted. We have managed to drive the Martian invaders back across the borders." The crowd cheered loudly at this, while a few among them smirked at Maximus and his friends and wore self-satisfied looks. "Now we are gathered here today to honor a man who helped us a great deal in achieving this and has always been a great ally to our country. Achilles, I hope this goes without saying, but you will always have a home in Minerva." Odysseus nudged Achilles at this, and he reluctantly stood up. The crowd cheered and clapped loudly for him, but Achilles still looked stone-faced and indifferent. When he sat down, the Empress said, "Well now then, if that is all then." But before she could complete the sentence, Daedalus, who was sitting next to her, whispered something in her ear. Athena looked up again and said, "Ah yes, a few brave soldiers also assisted in rescuing the High Counselor, and we are indebted to them as well." Maximus knew Daedalus was trying to be nice, but he really wished he hadn't done that. Around them arose an angry murmur from the gathering. When the 3 of them stood up, the applause they received was muffled and unfriendly. They sat down as quickly as they could. Maximus noticed Elisha give him a look of smug satisfaction at their humiliation. The crowd kept murmuring until Empress Athena loudly cleared her throat, silencing everyone. Then she declared, Well then, without any further delay, let the feast begin. At the command of the goddess, over a dozen metal trays flew into the room carrying a bizarre assortment of cuisines. The trays landed on the circular table and moved around on their own, serving each person. One of the trays paused before Maximus, but he didn't pick up the spoon. Don't worry, the trays won't run away. They have sensors that make sure a person is done helping themselves before they move away, Odysseus said, watching Maximus gape. But it wasn't the trays that worried him, but rather the food that was on it. He had no clue what it was. The only thing he was sure was that it was purple, and he knew one thing: food was not meant to be purple. He still served himself a bit to be polite. Once he was done, it moved to Hedger while another tray came in front of him. This one was no different in the scale of weirdness, as it had what appeared to be crackers topped with tiny tentacles, which he decided to pass. After a few seconds, his plate was filled with the sanest things he could find at the table, and it still looked like it belonged in a garbage bin. What the heck is this stuff? Hedger asked in a whisper. I don't know. I'm afraid it will start to move if I touch it, Maximus answered. They turned to Rex to share their distaste, but surprisingly he was already stuffing his mouth. Everyone else at the table had begun to eat as well. Hedger and Maximus shared a look. What are you guys waiting for? This stuff is great, Rex claimed. They were starting to draw attention again, partly because Maximus and Hedger hadn't touched their food yet, but mainly because Rex was not being too quiet. Everyone else at the table was following proper dining etiquette. Maximus realized that they should start eating soon so that they didn't appear rude. So they did, and the food didn't taste bad. But Maximus just couldn't accept that it was food he was putting in his mouth. Hedger nudged Rex and told him to quiet down, and soon people were starting to look away. Man, I can't wait for this to be over, Hedger said under his breath. Well, at least they're not staring anymore, Maximus said. Not exactly, Hedger replied, and Maximus followed his gaze. It was the girl, Elisha. She was giving him the coldest stare he had ever seen from across the table. I think she likes you, Hedger said sarcastically. Maximus tried to ignore the girl and continue with his meal, which proved to be difficult when everything on the plate looked like something a gorgon threw up. He realized it was easier to eat if he didn't see what he was putting into his mouth, so he ate while watching the other guests, being careful to avoid the direction in which Elisha was sitting. The one that caught his eye, though, was the goddess herself, and it was because of the simple fact that her silverware seemed to be floating in midair and feeding her. Odysseus noticed him staring and said, You didn't think Athena was a goddess just for her brains, did you? She has plenty of power to back her, too. She's the most powerful telekinetic in the world. Telekinetic? You mean she can just move things with her mind? Hedger asked, and Odysseus nodded. Maximus realized that though they looked human, the gods were definitely not ordinary. People began finishing their meals. Maximus noticed a lot of the guests came up to Achilles to thank or congratulate him. You seem pretty popular here. So is this where you have been staying since the war? Maximus inquired. Sometimes, Achilles replied. Athena was a friend even during the war, and I am always welcome here. But most of the time I tried to avoid big cities. Easier to stay dead that way. But so many people here already know you're alive. How is it the world doesn't know? Maximus said. Odysseus chuckled at this and said, My boy, this is the highest council of Minerva, Athena's most trusted generals and advisors, and they didn't reach here by not knowing how to keep a secret. So this is Minerva's finest, Rex observed. Funny, a few of them don't even look old enough to drink. He was referring to the few soldiers who were in regular uniform. Maximus noticed that all of them were around his age. Ah yes, you noticed our protégés, Odysseus said. You see, the Minervian army is divided into 8 legions. Each legion has a commander. I myself am the head of the 1st legion. He showed them a badge on his chest with a large golden 1 foot on it. Then he continued, It is customary for each of the commanders to pick one recruit from their legion who shows promise and train them for a commanding post. They study directly under us and is granted the title of Tyro. They are allowed to sit in on minor meetings such as this to gain experience. Hedger took a quick look around the table and said, You said 8 legions, right? But I only count 7 typos. It's Tyros. Sadly, the Tyro of the 4th Legion died in the war. They haven't found a replacement yet, Odysseus explained. None of them had anything to say to that. Maximus understood why everyone at this table hated them. Everyone there must have lost someone in the war against Ares, and the 3 of them sitting there was just a grim reminder. Once everyone was done with their food, the goddess stood up. Everyone returned to their seats, and the entire table was quiet again. The goddess began to speak. The victory at Fort Acropolis was a great one, but it was still just a battle and not the end of the war. However, a temporary truce has been called for a month against Ares. Everyone began to murmur at this, and one of the elves spoke. My goddess, but why? We must attack them while we have them on the run. Not an intelligent move, Odysseus pointed out. We may have won the battle, but not without cost. We are low on supplies, and a large number of our remaining men are injured, while Ares still has countless reserves in his barracks. More murmur followed. Maximus knew he was right. Minerva may have a much more advanced army, but Mars outnumbered them 3 to 1. Another man in expensive armor and a badge similar to Odysseus with a golden 5 feet on it spoke. How do we know that Ares will honor this truce? We don't. But this ceasefire is a necessary risk we must take to revitalize our troops, Odysseus said. Athena nodded to this and said, yes, the opportunity was too good to pass when it was presented to me by Hermes. Hermes, the god of communication, travelers, thieves, and speed. He also ruled over the country of Mercury and was the CEO of one of the largest companies in the world called Swiftfoot. He also happened to be Max's least favorite god. He had met Hermes personally earlier. The one thing he knew about him was that Hermes couldn't be trusted, but he didn't say any of this out loud. Somehow, Maximus figured his opinion was worth less than fodder at this table. There is another reason this truce is of great importance. Or have you all forgotten that the festival starts in a few weeks? It was the man called Dalton who spoke. Maximus had a feeling he knew what he was talking about. Athens held a festival called the Panathenea every 3 years. It was a huge event that lasted for days and was attended by people from all around the world. He remembered wanting to visit the festival when he was younger, and if memory served him right, it was supposed to be held around this time. War is no time for celebration, said the leader of Legion 5. On the contrary, Athena countered, the war is a reason we must hold the festival at all costs. Not doing so would only seem like weakness. Also, we have a duty to our people, not to mention it is a good reminder of what we are fighting for. Everyone nodded in agreement at these words. How goes the preparation for the Panathenea, Dalton? Everything is on schedule, my queen. The preparations across the city have already started, and the champion will arrive within a few days. Although we do have a slight problem regarding the tournament. Athena gave her advisor a stern look. Dalton said, well, nothing of importance, my queen. It's just that we have a slot open in the apprentice division due to the untimely death of one of our tyros. Athena nodded to this. Yes, the 4th division was most grievously damaged in the battle. How is Commander Leos doing? Dreadfully injured, but a live goddess, the 5th commander answered, but certainly in no condition to pick a new tyro. Can't we use someone else? A woman suggested. No, the tournament is meant to showcase the strength of our tyros so that they may earn the respect of the people once they become commanding officers. Therefore, only the tyros are allowed to participate from our army, Dalton said. The people began to murmur again until the goddess said, then we shall get an outsider. Surely one more will not make a difference for our brightest protégés. Yes, my queen, Dalton said. I shall find a replacement immediately. Goddess, if I may, spoke a girl's voice. It was Elisha's. Speak, child, Athena said. Well, I was just thinking perhaps we wouldn't have to look far for a replacement. Our guests of honor may be of help, Elisha proposed. Odysseus chuckled at this. You may be good, Elisha, but you or any tyro for that matter is still a century too young to be challenging Achilles. Oh, I would never dream of it, General. But I heard that Achilles himself has taken an apprentice. Perhaps he can fill the slot. A light began to flicker slowly inside Max's head as he realized she was talking about him. Is this true, Achilles? Athena asked, and he nodded in confirmation. Then Athena looked at the 3 Martians at the table, and her gaze finally fixed on Maximus. Is it you, boy? The goddess asked. Maximus choked a bit at being directly addressed by Athena, and words escaped him, but he finally managed to nod. Then will you help us? Athena asked. At that moment, Maximus had no idea what was happening. They wanted him to fight in some tournament. He wanted to say no way, that he had no idea what any of this even meant, but he realized how hard it was to say no to a goddess, one who had so politely asked him for help, and could probably turn him to a grease stain with a snap of her fingers. So against his desires, he nodded again and agreed to Athena's request. Then it's settled, Athena said. On to other matters. The conversation slowly shifted to other details regarding the festival, but Maximus wasn't listening anymore. He was still trying to wrap his head around what had just happened. He had just agreed to a tournament, one which he knew nothing about. He became aware that a few of the guests were still looking at him. A few held an expression that implied he was unworthy of entering their tournament, but most, including Elisha, had a different look, a smirk that meant they would enjoy watching him fail. He looked over at Hedger and Rex, who clearly had their opinions to state in the matter, but Maximus signaled to them to do it later. Achilles, on the other hand, still held the stone-cold, expressionless face he always did. But what really bothered Max was the uneasy smile Odysseus gave him. There was clearly some worry in his eyes. This gave him a sinking feeling in his stomach. After a few more minutes, the meeting was finally over. They all rose for the goddess to take her leave. Once the doors closed behind her, the other people began to disperse as well. Daedalus came over and suggested that the 3 of them return to their rooms. Once they reached their tower and were all back in Max's room, Hedger spoke. What the heck was that? Did you just agree to some random tournament there, Max? Yeah, Rex agreed. Didn't think you would be one for glory. You always tried to go unnoticed in the barracks. Maximus took a moment to collect his own thoughts. Then he said, Look, I really don't want to fight in any tournament, especially not one in which that Elisha girl wants me to enter. It's just that when Athena asked, I panicked, okay? He began pacing across the room, not knowing what to do next. So, what kind of tournament is this anyway? Hedger asked. Maximus shrugged. Rex scratched his chin and said, Well, I do know of one event in the festival, but I doubt this is the same. The Labyrinth Challenge is conducted during the Panathenea. Maximus had heard of the labyrinth challenge before from Rex. In ancient times, the greatest Minotaur hero in history used to take on all the challengers in a huge maze. That is until the current champion of Athens, Theseus, killed him. Now the challenge still remains in a new labyrinth in Athens, with challengers facing Theseus instead. Ironically, most of the challengers are usually Minotaurs hoping to reclaim their pride by defeating Theseus. No, it's definitely not that, Maximus said. I remember them mentioning something about the Tyros. What they were talking about is the Owlets tournament, Odysseus revealed as he entered the room with Achilles right beside him. Seriously, the Owlets tournament? That has to be the least threatening name for a tournament in history, Hedger said. Yes, but sadly the name does not divulge how last year one of our Tyros got his arm chopped right off, Odysseus replied. Hedger opened his mouth and closed it again, not knowing what to say. Look, this is a huge misunderstanding, Maximus began. I don't want to take part in any tournament. When the goddess asked, I just panicked. I realized as much. Well, Elisha didn't become one of our best Tyros by not knowing how to tactically handle a situation. She seems to be holding a grudge against you, one I'm guessing she hopes to finish at the tournament, Odysseus said. But still fighting in the tournament is a huge honor. If it's such an honor, why would you have trouble finding a replacement? Rex posed. Ah, well, that's because a Tyro has always been the victor for the past 17 years, Odysseus said. Well, isn't that just lovely? Maximus said dryly. You are right. It is unfair to ask you to do such a thing, Odysseus said. I'll make the arrangements to find a replacement. Thanks a lot, Odysseus. I really don't think me entering a tournament is a good idea, Maximus said, relieved. Max, do you want me to keep training you? Achilles asked suddenly. Everyone turned to him a bit confused. What? Maximus said. I asked if you wanted me to keep training you, Achilles repeated. Yes, of course, Max said. But perhaps I am wasting my time if I keep training a swordsman who refuses to fight, said Achilles. And with these words, Achilles walked out of the room. A few seconds of silence followed after Achilles exited. Finally, Rex said, Okay, what was that about? Maximus shrugged to show he had no idea himself. So does that mean you are entering the tournament then? Questioned Hedger. Maximus didn't know what to say. He really didn't want to enter the tournament at all, but Achilles made it sound like he didn't have a choice. He had the utmost respect for his mentor, but he didn't like the fact that he made it sound like he was running away from the fight. Perhaps it will be best if you don't decide right away. Get some sleep and talk to Achilles in the morning, Odysseus advised. The festival is still weeks away. There's plenty of time to find a replacement even if you back out tomorrow. With that, he left as well. The others weren't in a mood to talk either after that. They all headed back to their respective rooms, leaving Max alone with his thoughts. The Legions of Athena. Chapter 4. Just outside Athena's castle, the Owl's Nest, on one of the narrower side roads was a bar called the Thinking Cap. It was a modest little place that served mainly to the guards and the servants of the castle. This late at night, it was nearly empty, though. Just a couple of drunks remained too intoxicated to walk out of the door. On the bar stool at the corner, Achilles sat nursing his drink. This was his favorite spot in all of Athens, a peculiar choice in a city of such scientific wonders. But he was never a big fan of technology, and that's why he enjoyed the simple, quiet ambience of this place. It suited him better. The door opened and the bartender said, Sorry, we're closed for the... He stopped mid-sentence, seeing that it was Odysseus himself who had entered. Ah, General, didn't see it was you. Come in, the bartender invited. Odysseus smiled at the owner and went ahead to pull up a chair next to Achilles. You do know that we have a perfectly well-stocked bar in the castle, don't you? We have the best liquor in the world there, and it's free, Odysseus said. Calling that place a bar is a bit rich, don't you think? I prefer my drinking holes with a little less buttons, thanks, Achilles replied. Oh, come now, Odysseus said. The castle's not that bad. They recently changed their curtains from white to off-white. They both laughed at this. The astonishing dullness of the castle was a running joke between them. So, I take it you tracked me down here so late at night to tell me all about the castle's latest furnishings? Achilles asked jokingly. Well, there are a few other topics in mind, Odysseus replied. Like why you just ordered Max to enter the tournament. Achilles took another sip from his glass and said, I think it will do him some good. The kid could use the experience. And since when, may I ask, did you start getting so interested in some kid's battle experience? Odysseus probed. He's a good kid, Odysseus, Achilles said. A good soldier. He has real potential with a sword. He's... A lot like Patroclus, Odysseus finished. Achilles didn't reply to this. Hey, this is a good thing, Odysseus said. You haven't exactly been the most open soul since the war. It's good that you have started trusting people again. Must you analyze me every time I visit? Achilles countered. Besides, maybe you shouldn't be so glad that I'm making friends with Martians. I might be fighting you on the battlefield the next time. Oh, please. Those three seem as fond of Ares as much as I am, Odysseus said. Not surprising, really. You wouldn't believe how much hatred Ares has earned from his own subjects. And yet he rules, Achilles remarked. He rules because he is feared, Odysseus replied. and he is feared because he has power. Achilles smirked to himself and said, "And that is the absolute truth that has not changed in centuries. Power is all that matters. Speaking of Ares, do you really think it's a good idea, this truce with him? He isn't one who honors a word. A lesson we learned personally in the Trojan War," Achilles said. "Yes, his betrayal of our Greek army has not been forgotten by me or Athena," Odysseus replied. "But that is why the truce has been dealt with by Hermes, another snake-tongued god," Achilles said bitterly. "Perhaps, but as Athena said, the festival is of great importance to the city. She is not unprepared for betrayal, though. The entire might of the Minervian army will be present in Athens. Ares would be a fool to risk anything," Odysseus said. "Or he might see it as the perfect opportunity to finish the war in a single blow," mused Achilles. "Bah! Who are we to meddle in the business of God's old friend?" Odysseus said, "Come on, let's head back to the castle and get some shut-eye. With the festival coming up, I don't think either of us will be getting a lot of sleep the next few weeks." With that, the two legends left the bar and headed back to the castle. The Legions of Athena. Chapter 5. Maximus was just having a very weird dream. He was dreaming that he was taking part in the first stage of the tournament, which required him to eat 2 tons of yellow goop to advance to the next stage. But whether he managed to succeed in this tremendous endeavor, he did not know as he was roused by a knock at the door. There was still no light outside, but Maximus wasn't surprised. He figured it was Achilles. The man always started their training sessions much before the rooster crowed, so he rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and checked the time. It was still 2 o'clock at night. This was way too early even for Achilles, but whoever was outside was still pounding away at the door. He got out of his bed and opened the door and was pretty surprised to see a girl with big green eyes and noticeably feline features standing there. As soon as the door opened wide, she engulfed him in a big hug, covering his face in her reddish-brown hair. "Mia," he said once she finally let go. "Oh, Maxie, I miss that vacant expression on your face," Mia said. "Great," Maximus thought to himself. She's only been back for a second, and she's already pulling his leg. But inside, he was glad to see her again. But he wasn't going to tell her that. Instead, he said, "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Still obsessed with cats, I see," Mia said. "What? No," Maximus said. "I said that because you look like a never-mind." He stopped seeing that Mia was not really listening. She was already making herself comfortable on his bed. "Man, did I miss the feel of a real bed." "So did I wake you, Max?" she asked. "No, I mean, who could possibly be sleeping at 2 o'clock at night?" Max said dryly. "Oh, cheer up. It's not like you can't just sleep all morning," Mia retorted. "Actually, I can't," he said. "But more importantly, where the heck were you for so long?" Mia looked at him and sighed. "You don't want to know. You just woke me up in the middle of the night." "I think I deserve to know," Maximus said. Mia sat up and answered, "Why, at the High Athenian Magical Society, of course." "The what?" Maximus asked. "The High Athenian Magical Society," Mia repeated, or HAMS as I like to call it. Maximus knew that Athens was not famous for its magical superiority. When you have technology centuries ahead of the rest of the world, magic didn't have a significant role. "I didn't know Athens had a magical headquarters," Maximus said. Mia snorted at this. "Oh, please don't make that place sound so grand. I've seen garages that were bigger. Wow, that bad. I mean, I know technology is great, but neglecting magic completely sounds like a stupid move from Athena," Maximus said. Mia laughed out loud at this. "Look at you, finding weaknesses in gods," she said. "Of course they have magical divisions, dummy. Minerva is one of the largest countries in the world. They can't just ignore magic. The difference is they usually concentrate on magic that can blend well with technology." Maximus nodded to this, but the blank expression on his face seemed to have given him away. Mia sighed and asked, "You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you?" To which he just grinned. "Magic isn't just a single force, you know. It has many different branches like elemental magic and necromancy. And in my case, nature magic." "Oh yeah, you've mentioned that," Max said. "Yeah, anyway, nature magic is the branch that is least compatible with technology, so Athens does nearly no research into it. The HAMS is the only division that handles it here, which sucked for me. Staying in this castle was not that great either, you know," Maximus began to say, but Mia cut him off. "Don't even go there, Max," she said, "because whatever the case is, this is a castle with a real bed and a cooling system and a complete lack of bugs. The HAMS is not even in the city. It's in a nearby forest outside the Aegis barrier. The place was basically just a large hut with a few kooky sorcerers. So, why did they send you there anyway?" Maximus asked. They had to run some tests," she replied, vaguely not meeting his eyes. "The head sorceress there is really powerful, supposedly. Personally, she just gave me the creeps." Maximus was about to ask more about the tests, but he noticed her involuntarily clutching her left arm, where she had a mark under her sleeve. A mysterious mark that was somehow connected to her past, and which she hated talking about. He realized that further questions on the topic would just put her in a bad mood. Changing the topic, he said, "Well, you're here now, and you are staying, right?" She gave him a smile and said, "Of course I'm staying with you guys. You would all be lost without me." Even though she got on his nerves at times, He was glad to have her back on the team. "Now stop standing around," she said, getting back on her feet. "Let's go wake up the others." Maximus felt like he had slept only for a short while, but when he got up the next day, it was already lunchtime. He would have slept for longer if Hedger hadn't woken him up. Everyone was already in the dining hall when he entered, but all of them looked like they had just awakened. Both Hedger and Mia had bowls of blue goop in front of them, and when Max sat down, the machine served a similar bowl to him as well. Only Rex had a plate with a large red brick on it. "How come you get special treatment?" Hedger asked. "Probably 'cause I'm better looking than you three," Rex quipped with a grin. "As valid a point as that is," Mia said, rolling her eyes, "it's probably because you are a minotaur. I mean, you do have food habits different from humans." "You can say that again," Rex agreed. "I mean how you people eat fish. I'll never understand." "So last time I checked, I was still a sprite," Hedger chipped in. "Where's my special goop?" Mia shrugged at this. "I don't know. Maybe your digestive system is similar to ours. Well, I for one demand that I be fed with proper sprite diet instead of this crap," he said. "Which is what exactly?" Max inquired. "I have no idea. I was hoping chicken wings. I'll have to find out when I see a sprite," Hedger replied. "Good luck finding a sprite here," Mia said. The three of them gave her a quizzical look. "What, haven't you guys noticed that there are not a lot of sprites around? Well, this entire continent?" Mia pointed out. "I mean, I've been traveling for a while, and Hedger's the first one I've met." Now that Max thought about it, he hadn't seen many himself. He had seen a few back in the trenches, but they were travelers. He was pretty sure Hedger was the only one who actually lived there. "What? Are you saying that sprites are extinct?" Hedger asked. "No, but you do have one of the smallest population among all the races. Also, the sprite communities that do exist are not in any of the places nearby," observed Mia. The look on Hedger's face told that all this was new information to him. "Well, I never really thought about this stuff," he said. "I mean, the trenches where we grew up housed a very mixed crowd, so I never even imagined there would be any exclusive sprite communities." Hedger would have said more, but just then something began to ring in his pocket. Hedger took out the mobile, which still had a broken screen, but at least the call function was working, it seemed. "What the heck is that?" Rex asked. "Is that a mobile?" "Wow, I've never actually used one, but you can fence them for a lot of money on the outside," Mia said. The others gave her a stare at this. "Yes, I used to fence stolen goods in the black market. Now can we move past that and see who's calling?" Hedger answered the mobile and said hello. After a few seconds, he said okay and hung up. Then he turned to Maximus and said, "It was Achilles. He wants to meet you at the palace garden." "Guess he wants to know what you decided," Rex said. "Decided what?" Mia asked, confused. Maximus still hadn't got a chance to tell her about Achilles wanting him to join the tournament or give up his training. "Fill her in, would you? I better not keep my old teacher waiting." "Wait, does that mean—" Hedger began. "Yeah," Max said. "There's no way I'm entering that tournament." Maximus had pondered over his decision a great deal. He had decided to decline the offer. He hated tournaments. Back in the army, they used to be held at least once a month. The truth was, even though he knew he was a good fighter, he just didn't perform that well in front of a crowd. It was stupid, and he knew it. But the fact was, he fought much worse than he usually did in the barracks when only his fellow soldiers were watching. He was afraid that in front of a stadium filled with people, he would just freeze. Despite the fact that the Owlets tournament was the smallest of the three events being held, people did still die. Although the match was not to death, a few unlucky contestants did still lose their lives. But what really swung the decision was the way Achilles had given him an ultimatum. He held Achilles in the highest regard, but he did not like anyone else taking decisions for him. He thought about all this as he walked out of the West Tower. Since Achilles had returned, all of them were allowed to move about the castle freely. It seems that he had to be there for the rest of them to be trusted. He was their unofficial babysitter. A pang of guilt pricked Maximus. Achilles had done so much for them, even more for him personally with his training and everything. Maybe it wasn't too much for him to ask for something in return. In fact, now that he considered it, he realized that if he pulled out of this tournament, it would probably reflect badly on Achilles as well. Especially since everyone at that table yesterday, including Athena, now knew that Achilles trained him personally. Great, Maximus thought to himself. Now he was back to square one, wondering whether he should join the tournament or not. He decided that he had better talk to Achilles before taking his decision. He also realized something else at that moment. He had no idea where he was going. Maximus felt pretty brainless right then. It was the first time he had left the West Tower on his own, and he had no idea about where anything was in this castle. It was a pretty big castle. He walked down a few corridors aimlessly to try his luck, but this turned out to be a bad idea as well. After a few random turns, he had lost track of the way he had come. All the corridors looked exactly the same. He wondered how people found their way around this place. All the walls and doors were identical in every way, the same as in the West Tower. After about another 15 minutes of being lost, he realized that he would have to ask someone for directions. There were people moving around in the corridors. He had already passed quite a few, but after his experience with the locals at the banquet, he was not thrilled at the prospect of further interactions with them. Luckily, he blended in well thanks to the gray clothes that had been given from the castle. Most of the people who passed him by completely ignored him. He decided to ask directions to the first person he saw next. In a few seconds, he came across an elven woman. "Excuse me, miss, but could you tell me how to get to the castle garden?" he asked. "Why, of course, my dear," she said with a smile. "But which garden are you referring to?" "The castle has three." "Three gardens?" Well, he wasn't expecting that. Whichever's closest to the west tower, I guess." The expression on the elf's face changed. Her smile vanished and was replaced by worry. "The west tower? Are you one of the Martians?" Maximus nodded reluctantly to this. He could see this was not going well. "Well, he garden closest to their eyes." She began to stutter when someone else came around walking. The elf lady quickly went to his side. "Oh, Theo, thank the gods," she said like she had just escaped from a rabid dog. "This Martian wants to know the way to the garden," she said breathlessly. Maximus was annoyed by this. He had asked for directions to a garden, not for the schematics of their vaults. The new guy, Theo, looked at him. He was human and around his age, with shiny blonde hair and a visibly well-maintained body. If Max had to take a guess, he would have said he was a soldier. "Why don't you leave Sala? I'll handle this," he told the elf, and she hurried away without even glancing back. "I know you," Theo continued. "You're Achilles' student, right? I saw you yesterday at the feast. I'm Theo, by the way," he introduced. Maximus was a little surprised by the friendly greeting, but he was glad to have finally met someone who didn't automatically hate his guts here. "I'm Maximus," he said. "You were at the feast?" "Yep, I'm the Tyro of Division 6, Theo replied. "So you're going to be one of the competitors in the Owlets tournament, right?" "I'm not so sure about that. I was thinking of backing out," Maximus confessed. "Oh well, that's a disappointment. In any case, let me show you to the garden. I'm heading that way," Theo said with a smile. Theo led the way as Maximus followed. After a few corridors, they started going up a flight of stairs. "Shouldn't the garden be on the ground floor?" Maximus asked. "What? Oh yes, it's just that there's a shortcut from the next floor," replied Theo. Maximus thought that this was a bit strange, but decided not to push it. After all, this guy was a tyro, so he probably knew the castle well. Moreover, he didn't want to be rude to the only person in the castle who seemed to be kind enough to help. After walking for a bit more, they reached a pretty big door. "Through here," Theo said as the metallic door slid open and Maximus entered. But there was definitely no garden there. Instead, he was now standing in a huge gymnasium. The place was pretty big and had a lot of training equipment in it. Lots of high-tech exercise machines were spread across the floor. There was also a sparring ring in the center. Quite a few people were present as well. Most were training and a few were resting on the benches on the sides. Theo entered behind him and the door slid shut automatically. "Where to now?" Max asked, sensing something was amiss. "Not very bright, are you?" Theo said with a grin. "Hey, Elisha, look what I found wandering the halls." From one of the corners of the room near a few punching bags, 3 people walked up to them. The one in the center was none other than Max's least favorite Athenian, Elisha. She was flanked on either side by 2 more soldiers. One was a guy who looked a few years older to him and almost twice his size. He had a shaved head and a face that looked equally menacing and vacant. Maximus imagined this must be what a baby troll looked like. The other was an elf girl with silver hair and purple eyes. She had the pointy features common to all elves, along with a very pale white skin. "Well, this is quite a find indeed," Elisha said as loudly as she could. "So nice to make your acquaintance. I never did get your name, Martian." The other people in the room were all watching them now. Maximus noticed that almost everyone in the room was around his age. From their demeanor, it was clear that Elisha and the others were their superior officers. A few seemed worried, but most seemed to be enjoying the new development. Maximus looked at Theo, who had the widest sneer on his face. He wanted to punch that guy right in the face, but he was sure that it would end badly. "Hey, she asked you a question," the elf girl said. Now, Livian, maybe he's just too slow to understand what I asked," Elisha said sarcastically. "Perhaps Berg can help him out." The big guy, Berg, cracked his knuckles at these words. "It's Maximus," he said. "Ah, well, Maximus, do you know what an honor it is to fight in the Owlets tournament? And do you know why I was so keen to present you with that honor?" Elisha said in a sickeningly sweet tone. Maximus shook his head at this. He was starting to get worried. The situation was not looking good for him. "Well, I'll tell you," she continued, her voice slowly rising in anger. "It's so that I can destroy you in front of my whole nation, so that I can show to everyone just how weak and pathetic you Martian scum are, no matter which glorified cripple trained you." "What?" Maximus thought to himself, did she just call Achilles a glorified cripple? The anxiety that he felt before was now replaced by anger. He really wished he had his sword now, because if he did, it would surely be glowing red. "So understand, Maximus, there is no way you'll get out of this in one piece, because one of us Tyros is going to break every bone in your body, that is, if you don't wet yourself when you enter the arena," Elisha threatened. Then she mocked in her fake, sweet voice. "So what do you think will break first, your body or your mind?" Maximus looked at her with a smirk and retorted, "I was thinking your necks." The moment he said those words, he knew he was in trouble. "Get him!" Elisha shouted, and Berg launched himself at him. He dodged, though, and landed a kick on the back of Berg's left knee. The big guy was down on one knee now, but this just made things much worse. Soon more people around him started coming closer to fight, and he knew he was done for, but there was still one thing he wanted to do before he went down. He turned to Theo and said, "Thanks a lot," right before he sucker punched him on the face so hard it knocked him to the floor. But everything went downhill from there. He was surrounded, and Berg had gotten back on his feet again. He landed a few more punches, but to no real use. He was severely outnumbered, and soon he was out cold on the ground. The Legions of Athena, Chapter 6. Maximus awoke in a place where he had been once before, the familiar sterile smell of the infirmary, the same one they had been brought to when they first entered Athens. He woke up on one of its many beds and tried to sit up. Even as he did so, he was hurting all over his body, but he managed to sit up. Well, I guess they didn't kill me then, he thought to himself. He saw that he wasn't alone in the room either. Mia was fast asleep on a chair next to his bed. There was someone else also on one of the other beds in the corner. It was a man in his late 30s with brown hair and a goatee. He was definitely in a bad shape. Half his body, including his right leg and arm, were in a cast, while most of his upper torso was swathed in bandages. His head was covered in bandages as well. He looked at Maximus as he sat up, and their eyes met. But the wounded man did not say anything. He continued looking at the ceiling, ignoring Maximus. "Look who's finally up," Mia said. Maximus turned to look at her. "Oh, hey," he said. "How long was I out?" "Over 10 hours, I'd say," she replied. "We have been taking turns at your bedside. Sorry about that," he said, "but I was sort of ambushed." "Don't be sorry, you idiot. That's what friends are for." "We heard about the ambush, or at least one version of it," she began. "The story was that you walked into the Tyros training area and challenged a few of them to a fight." Maximus was outraged by what he'd just heard. "What? That is not what happened. Who the hell told you that?" he demanded indignantly. "That girl, Elisha. Rex filled me in on what happened at the banquet. We figured that it was a lie. Rex wanted to go beat the real story out of her, but we managed to cool him down." "So what really happened?" Maximus filled her in on the real story. At the end of it, Mia remarked, "So you were outnumbered 20-1 and you decided to pick a fight. You really aren't that smart, are you?" He scowled at her, muttering, "It seemed like the right thing to do. I hope it was worth it. Anyway, I better go inform the others. I promised them I'd tell them when you woke up," said Mia as left the infirmary. Maximus examined himself to see if anything was broken. Luckily, nothing was cracked. But his muscles ached in a million places. He wanted to stay awake till the others came, but he simply couldn't keep his eyes open. He realized he had probably been administered sedatives in the course of treatment. Before long, he fell asleep again. "Hello, Maximus," greeted a voice in the darkness. Maximus opened his eyes to see darkness all around him. He was dreaming and he knew it, but he wasn't worried. It was time for another chat with the voice from his sword. "Hey, voice guy, haven't heard from you in a while. Still haunting my dreams, I see," observed Maximus. "I realize I'd been silent for a while. I thought it best, seeing as I was detected the last time," the voice admitted. "You mean by Hermes?" said Maximus. "Yes, as I had confided to you, I wish to remain unseen by the world for now. The Olympian gods are the last beings I wish to inform of my survival," the voice said. "You're a shady guy, you know. I hope you're not some sort of evil monster I'm helping break out from your sword prison," Maximus said. "I promise you I'm not evil." "As for monster, no, I'm something much worse," the voice replied. Somehow this did not put Max's mind at ease. "Do not worry, child. Only my enemies need to fear me. You, on the other hand, have my gratitude," the voice continued. "I'd rather prefer answers than gratitude, though," Maximus retorted. "What do you mean?" asked the voice. "The last time we spoke, you said something about my lineage. Care to elaborate on that?" said Max. "I was hoping you could tell me," the voice replied. Maximus was confused. "What? How should I know? I'm an orphan. I've always been an orphan. I have no idea about my parents or any other relative for that matter. So why would you think my lineage is special?" "Because you unsheathed my sword. It would require quite a degree of power to do so. Power which lay dormant within you. That is only possible if you have a unique lineage," the voice explained. "I thought you allowed me to unsheath the sword," Max asked. "True. You couldn't have done it without my permission, but your own power was equally essential," revealed the voice. Maximus was disappointed by what he had just heard. He was hoping for a bit more than just some vague, special lineage garbage. "So I assume this is not the topic you were hoping to discuss then?" Maximus asked finally. "Ah, yes," the voice said. "I came to disclose something different." "Please don't say you want me to run into another volcano," he said. "No, nothing of the sort. But I have noticed that you are trying to awaken the sword's power at will," said the voice. "Not much luck, though." Perhaps, but I would advise you to be more discreet. I can sense that you are angered by the Tyros, and I know how young ones like you would respond. But be careful, said the voice. Power is a thing that is coveted in any millennia, and in a city such as this, it is easily noticed, and you will find that animosity is often a more effective weapon than a blade. Maximus was about to ask what he meant by that, but it continued by saying, We have no more time, I'm afraid. Your friends are about to wake you. How do you know that? Max asked. In fact, how are you even talking to me? I left the sword back in the room. The sword may be my prison, Maximus, but it is one I created myself for my own survival. Please do not insult me by thinking that my powers are limited to its presence. Maximus wanted to ask more, but the darkness began to shift again. Soon he was looking at the fluorescent tube lights on the infirmary ceiling. He was awake again, and the voice had just left him with another pile of unanswered questions. Well, it's about time, Rex mumbled next to him. Hedger and Mia were with him as well. Maximus noticed that his face was wet with water. He knew that this was Hedger's handiwork. This was not the first time he had gotten this rude awakening. This was how Hedger used to wake him back in the trenches as well. Did you have to use water? Just shaking me awake would have been fine, he asked. Now where's the fun in that? Besides, think of it as punishment for falling asleep before we got here yesterday night, Hedger said with a grin. Maximus looked out the window to see that it was the next day. He couldn't believe he was asleep for so long. The chat with the voice only seemed to have lasted 10 minutes. The doctors already came and discharged you, by the way. We've been waiting around for an hour just for you to wake up, Mia said. So Max, how you feeling? Rex asked. Maximus got out of his bed and checked himself. Everything seemed to be okay, and nothing was hurting anyway. Yeah, I'm good, he said. Good. Then let's go find that little Bolfa and introduce her to my metal fist, Rex said. Bolfa was a swear word from the ancient Minotaurian language. The language itself was almost extinct and was now only spoken in highly orthodox Minotaur tribes. Rex didn't speak much of it either, but he did somehow manage to learn all its swear words. I hope you idiots aren't seriously considering it, Hedger said as they started walking back to the tower. This isn't the trenches where the soldiers would just place bets at a street brawl. So what, we should just do nothing, Rex said. Well, we could poison her, Hedger said. All of them stopped and stared at him. I mean, with a strong laxative or something. Yeah, I think we better leave our revenge schemes for later. Achilles will be waiting for us in the tower, Mia said. Maximus had forgotten about that. He had completely stood him up in the garden. He had an excuse, being unconscious and all. But what Max really wondered was what the heck Achilles must have ended up doing sitting in the garden. He really didn't seem like the type to go around sniffing flowers. Maybe he ended up signing some autographs. No, that wouldn't be it either. Achilles was world famous, all right, but not the kind of fame where people recognized him by sight. Well, he had though when they first met, but that was different. He was sort of Max's idol growing up. Besides, everyone here except for Athena's inner circle thought he was dead like the rest of the world. Maximus thought for a while and finally concluded that he must have sat and meditated. He sure did do that a lot, and worse, made it a large part of his own training as well. Achilles was waiting for them in the dining area when the four of them entered. Are you hurt? Achilles asked, and Maximus shook his head in response. Good. I already heard what happened from the Tyros, Achilles said. And you don't seriously believe that, do you? Rex asked. No, I don't. And neither does Odysseus. But that is the story we're all going with. We have caused enough trouble, as it is, Achilles said. How the heck did we cause trouble? Hedger asked. Letting you stay here has been a very unpopular decision, and the entire burden of it rests on Odysseus. So the best thing we can do is keep our heads down, Achilles said. Odysseus really shouldn't go to all this trouble. It's not like any of us want to stay at the castle, Maximus said. Achilles sighed and said, I guess you're all too young to have given this much thought. But tell me if not here, then where? You can't stay anywhere beyond the wall because Ares is sure to have a few spies monitoring the area. As for staying somewhere in the city itself, how do you think the people will react if they found out that you are from Mars? And in Athens, it's not a question of if, but a question of when. Information travels fast here. The castle is the best bet in a bad situation. None of them had an answer to that. Achilles was right, they hadn't thought that far. But it still didn't make them any happier about it. So anyway, Maximus's Achilles continued. The others tell me that you have already made a decision. Perhaps it was a bit harsh of me to give you an ultimatum regarding the tournament. I will continue training you if you like, even though you won't be entering the tournament. I will inform Athena's people to find someone else. Maximus had totally forgotten about the tournament in the middle of all this. Wait, hold on, Maximus said. I had decided not to enter, but let's just say I had a change of heart. Rex laughed loudly at this, and Hedger said, So much for keeping your head down. The Legions of Athena, Chapter 7. A week had passed, and Maximus had his training back in full form. He had spent most of the last few days training with Achilles. They were in the palace garden, the place where he was supposed to meet Achilles before. This was one of the smaller gardens in the castle and had tall growing hedges all around. At the center of the garden was a small clearing of grass, which was where they were training. Maximus rarely saw other visitors in the garden, and the occasional person they did see stayed out of their way. The training had mainly consisted of Maximus practicing with his blade while Achilles meditated. He did occasionally correct him, and they even spared a couple of times, but Maximus couldn't touch him. Their matches always ended with Maximus disarmed and on the ground, while Achilles barely broke a sweat. But today was different. Rex had come along with them to help with the practice. Achilles said it would be good for him to practice against different opponents, and Maximus was glad about that. He was getting real tired of getting knocked on his back, and with Rex he could at least have a fair fight. This wasn't the first time he had faced Rex. They used to spar all the time back in the trenches, and he'd like to think they were pretty evenly matched, though the scores did say something else. "What was our final score, Maxie, back in the trenches?" Rex said. "Don't remember," Max mumbled. This was a lie, of course, he remembered it, and it was not like Rex would let him forget, like now 57-48 with the advantage to me if I remember right. Does that sound right, Maxie? I know that specifically because if I get one more win, it's a 10-point lead for me, Rex said with a grin. Maximus was really annoyed by his friend right now. It was just friendly competition, but Maximus hated the fact that he had fallen so behind, especially since they were neck and neck during the first 20 matches. The fact that he bought up the scores in front of Achilles didn't help either. "You two have already fought, I take it?" Achilles asked. "Yeah, we used to spar all the time back in the trenches, but you can't count that, I guess." "Things have changed," Rex said, flexing his new metallic arm. This just made Max feel even worse. When they used to fight, Rex didn't even have both his arms, and now he had a metal one that turned into a hammer. He felt like his chances against Rex were slim, to say the least. "In that case, why don't we start with a clean slate then? The first 1 to 10 wins," Achilles said. "Sure," Rex said. 10-0 does have a nice ring to it. Maximus agreed to this too, and he was definitely not going to let the score be 10-0 for sure. Rex may have a shiny new hand, but he has a powerful new blade too. Not to mention he was trained by Achilles and he knew he was much better than he was in the trenches. "Stop blabbering and let's fight already," Max said with confidence he really did not have. They began. Rex started with a full-on charge with his horns. Maximus knew he would do this. He always did. It was how he liked to start of most of their fights, so he dodged it easily. But how came the new part? He had dodged to Rex's left as he always did, because before, he didn't have to worry about the left arm. That had changed. Rex had changed his bionic hand to its battle hammer form and took a swing at him. He thought he was done for, but he managed to block with his sword at the last second. But there was no time to rest. Rex had already begun trying to pound him from both sides. The hammer took some getting used to. What used to be Rex's weak point was now his most dangerous weapon. But as the fight progressed, Max noticed that he was able to avoid all of Rex's attack easily. At first he thought the new arm was making Rex slower than before, but that wasn't it. He was just much faster and he hadn't even noticed it. It seemed sparing with Achilles and trying to keep up with his speed had in turn made him much faster as well. The match went on for another 10 minutes, and Rex was starting to sweat. Maximus, on the other hand, was still in full form. Then he finally saw his opening. When Rex raised his hammer for an attack from above, he managed to wedge his sword into Rex's left shoulder. Then with sharp kick to the Minotaur's stomach, Rex's head was down to his eye level, and he had his blade to his neck. "The match goes to Maximus's," Achilles said from the side. Maximus couldn't believe he had won the sword fight so easily. He was not even tired, but his own surprise was nothing compared to Rex's shock. Rex opened his mouth to say something but then decided not to. Maximus, on the other hand, grinned impishly at his friend and said, "You know what, 10-0 does sound like fun." They continued sparring the entire day, while Achilles watched, and the final score at the end of the evening was a surprise. It was 10-4, with Maximus winning the last 3 matches in a row and ending their little contest with a 6-point lead. It was already nightfall when the last match drew to a close. Rex was not in the mood to stick around trading notes. He mumbled something about taking a shower and left the gardens. Maximus, on the other hand, was thrilled at his victory. He didn't even feel tired, and at that euphoric moment he felt like he could win the entire tournament. "Happy with the results, I presume?" Achilles asked. "Oh yeah, I've never actually beaten Rex in any of our sparring contests before. Guess all that training did a lot more good than I thought," Maximus replied. "Yes, unexpectedly so," Achilles remarked. Maximus thought this was a curious reply. Surely Achilles had noticed his improvement earlier, even if he hadn't. His confused expression seemed to have given him away, because Achilles said, "It's nothing to worry about, Max. Your increase in speed and stamina was expected, but I did not expect you to match Rex in strength. Even though you dodged most of his attacks, the ones you blocked, you actually managed to push him back." Maximus hadn't considered this, but he was right. He had never been able to hold out against Rex's direct attacks before. However, it didn't make sense that his training alone would make him as strong as a Minotaur. "In any case, I better head back," Achilles said. "Odysseus has been very busy due to the festival, and we still have a few matters to discuss with Daedalus." "You mean regarding why he was kidnapped?" Maximus asked. Achilles did not answer. He wore a grim expression on his face and bade him good night. They went their separate ways from the staircase. Maximus proceeded to his room and changed. He couldn't wait for dinner. Even the castle's goop would taste fine right now. After a quick visit to his room, He headed straight to the dining room. He took his sword with him as well. After the mishap with the tyros, he understood why Achilles never let his blade out of his sight. You could never tell when trouble might find you. When it does, it's always better to have your blade at your side. He had decided to make a habit of carrying it around everywhere like his master. As he entered, the others were already there. "What are we having tonight?" "I'm starving," Maximus said. "White bricks today with a side helping of brooding minotaur," Hedger quipped. "Mind explaining why he's extra sulky today?" Maximus couldn't help smiling at this. Rex hated losing a fight, and he rarely did too, especially to him. It was understandable he would be a bit grumpy, so he figured he had better try and cheer him up. "Oh, come on, Rex. You are not still sour about the match, are you?" "It was just practice," he said. "What happened during practice?" Mia asked, scooping a spoonful of the pudding like white brick onto her plate. "I'll tell you what happened. He beat me 10-4, Rex answered. Mia didn't seem to get what the big deal was, but Hedger started laughing like a maniac. "You serious?" Hedger asked. Maximus nodded in affirmation. "Well, that explains a lot," Hedger said, continuing to laugh. "Look, I'm not bothered that you beat me." Rex said, "You've been training with Achilles. There was bound to be some improvement. I get it, you're faster, your sword skills have improved and all that. But how the heck are you stronger than me?" "What?" Maximus said, confused. "By the gods, I'm a freaking minotaur. There is no way in Hades you should be able to match my strength. And I'm telling you, you weren't this strong before," Rex said. Maximus realized that Rex seems to be thinking along the same lines as Achilles. It was true that he had pushed Rex back a bit in the fights, but he didn't feel that it was due to some inhuman strength. "I think you're overreacting, Rex. I mean, my training just made me a better fighter," Maximus replied, trying to hold his case. "Training? Oh, this was no training, Maxie. You didn't just block my attacks today. You literally hit them aside. And that kick you gave me in the first match? I've been kicked by you before, and it used to hurt as much as baby unicorns. But now it was enough to stagger me," Rex said. "You do look strangely active for someone who just went through a whole day of training," Mia chipped in. Not her too, Maximus thought to himself, but this did seem true. It was obvious that Rex had not even an ounce of energy left in him. But he, on the other hand, felt strangely fine. "You know there is an easy way to settle this. You guys could just arm wrestle," Hedger said. Rex seemed to think this was a good idea too. "Yeah, that could work. But no holding back, Max," he said. Maximus still thought the entire thing was stupid. He turned to Mia, hoping that she thought so too. "Personally, I have no idea what you guys are talking about. Is this like a guy thing?" "But Max, if a stupid arm wrestling match will settle it, you might as well do it," she said. Maximus signed and agreed, "Okay, fine, if it'll get you guys off my back." They sat down and held their right arms ready to wrestle. Maximus had no intention of holding back, mainly because he saw no way of winning this thing. Back in the Loose Cannon, the pub they used to hang out in the trenches, Rex was the unofficial arm wrestling champion. It was the only sport of strength that only required one arm, so Rex got good at it real fast. Even if all that didn't make sense, the fact that he was human and Rex was a minotaur was enough. The difference in strength between the two races was extraordinary. "Ready, break!" Hedger shouted, signaling the match to start, and they were off. Within a few seconds, Max's arm was going down fast, no surprise there. Maximus knew he didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of winning this, but he still didn't give up. But soon his arm was inches from the table, and only a few seconds from losing. Suddenly a surge of strength, and Maximus just held Rex's arm in place. And then the impossible happened. He was pushing Rex back. He was pushing a 7-foot-tall, 250-pound minotaur back. They were back to the starting position now, and Maximus just let go, a bit shaken by what had just happened. "Well, that was unexpected," Mia said in a low voice. "See, I told you. Somehow you have gotten unnaturally strong," Rex said. Maximus was a bit stunned to answer at first, but Rex was right. There was no way he should be able to do that. "So what, you guys think I'm jacked up on steroids or something?" Maximus asked. "We don't think you did anything. You seem more surprised than the rest of us," Hedger said. "But maybe it has to do with something you picked up lately." Maximus knew they were all thinking the same thing now. Each of them was eyeing his sword with caution. I'm not feeling too hungry," he said to his friends, and excused himself before any of his friends could stop him. Once he was back in his room, he tried to go to sleep as fast as he could, but his mind was riddled with questions again. Was the sword really enhancing him without his notice? He hadn't even told the others about the voice that came free with it, and if they wouldn't have freaked out about it before, they definitely would if he told them now. As he lay on the bed trying to fall asleep, he muttered, "Okay, voice, I know you can hear me. We need to talk." The Legions of Athena, Chapter 8. Achilles had just entered his quarters after his training with Maximus. Max was really improving, he thought to himself, perhaps even a bit unnaturally fast. But he did not have time to worry about that just now. He still hadn't found time to speak with Daedalus about his kidnapping. He had headed to the war front the day after he reached Athens. He had no plans of joining the war full out, but it felt wrong to not help since he was here. It wasn't uncommon for him to be working with Athens. In the past 5 years since the war with Mars started, he had acted as a mercenary for Athena on multiple occasions. But this time he really was not needed. By the time he and Odysseus reached with the cavalry, the battle was mostly over, and there were just a few Martian soldiers left in the area. They had left back to Athens as quickly as they had went, leaving Daedalus' son, Icarus, in charge of the battlefront. The whole banquet for his return was an unnecessary event, but he knew why Athena did it. She still hoped that he would officially join her ranks in the Minervian army. She had asked him on multiple occasions, even offered him the post of a champion a long time ago. But he had declined all her offers. Even though Athens was the closest thing he had left to a home, he would not be part of the kingdom. His kingdom ended with the Greek Empire, an empire that won the Trojan War and perished along with it. A kingdom ruled by men, not gods, and he was not looking for a replacement for it. He left his room and went off to find Odysseus. His friend has been extremely busy with the upcoming festival, but he too was curious with what Daedalus had to say. Achilles hoped to find him now while he came for dinner, before he got called away for some other errands regarding the festival. He was hoping to find him in the commander's private dining hall somewhere, but before he reached far from his room, a familiar face caught up to him. It was Icarus, son of Daedalus, and the commander of the 8th Legion of Athena. Icarus was not a person you would easily mistake. His entire body was covered in a mechanical suit built by his father. Its most extraordinary features by far were its metal wings on its back. But the suit was not just for show. An ill-fought battle against the sun god Apollo had left Icarus's body with severe burns. That did not heal. The suit was the only thing preventing him from feeling excruciating pain. I didn't realize that you had returned from the war front, Achilles said. Icarus's face too was covered by this suit, a plain mask made of bronze with nothing but 2 openings for the eyes. I returned yesterday along with the champion. All the high ranks were ordered back for the festival, but I'm afraid we don't have time to catch up. I was coming to find you and give you this, Icarus said, handing over a bag to Achilles. He opened it to find an Athenian guard uniform inside. He looked at Icarus for an explanation. Wear this and come to the throne room. Icarus said, make sure that you have the helmet on as well. We have a visitor and goddess Athena would like it if you were there as well, just in case. Achilles didn't like the sound of that. Whoever the visitor was seemed to have Athena worried enough to want him at her side as well. Who is it? He asked. Icarus unfolded his wings to glide back to the throne room. Before he left, he said, the ferryman. Achilles changed into the royal guard uniform and headed for the throne room. He knew why Athena wanted him there. In case there was any trouble, he would be a secret ace in the hole for her since her guest wouldn't be expecting it. And he was a man who could create a lot of trouble, the ferryman. The ferryman was not a name you would hear if you lived a normal, honest life. But in the murky alleys and the shady pubs visited by scoundrels and mercenaries, you would hear that name in whispers. It was a moniker given to one of the most influential officers of the underworld, Charon the Consigliore to Don Hades. The Consigliore, which roughly translated to counselor, was one of the highest positions in the underworld. It was a position held by an advisor or spokesperson to a mafia don, and this was the position held by Charon. Don Hades had not left his kingdom in many centuries, and rumor is that it is because he has been charged with the duty of eternally guarding the great prison of Tartarus, which held the Titans. In any case, this meant that he has to send someone else in his place to speak for him, and that person was Charon. Him acting as a link between Hades and the rest of the world is what earned him the name ferryman in the first place. As the saying goes, one must pass the darkest waters to reach Hades, and only the ferryman knows the way. So in short, when Athena deals with Charon, she will be dealing with Don Hades himself. When Achilles entered the throne room, it was already packed with quite a large number of people. All of Athena's royal council seemed to be there. In addition to them, there were around 20 royal guards as well. They all wore uniforms identical to the one Achilles wore. He walked up to Odysseus and pressed a button on the side of his helmet, which opened his visor to reveal it was him. Ah, Achilles, you're here. Good, Odysseus said. Did Icarus tell you about our guest? Achilles nodded in response. It was easy to see Odysseus was worried. The grim expression never left his face. Station yourself along with the other guards. There is probably no need to worry, but keep your eyes open, just in case, Odysseus cautioned. Achilles put his visor back on and headed to his position. Athena's throne room was large and circular in shape. It was situated on the topmost floor of the castle, with only the towers of the castle rising higher. There were pillars decorating the circumference of the metal walls, while large life-size marble statues stood between them. The roof, however, was a large glass dome, held by a metal frame shaped like a honeycomb. The glass roof revealed the night sky above them. It was pitch black with no moon or stars visible. At one end of the room was the entrance, with large reinforced metallic doors that opened automatically. On the opposite end of the doors, on a slightly raised platform, was an elegant silver throne. It was kind of plain as far as thrones go, with not a lot of decorations on it, except for the statue of an owl with its wings spread and an olive branch in its mouth, perched on top of it. On it sat the goddess herself wearing a flowing gold and white gown. 3 distinguished people stood on Queen Athena's left, one of whom was Daedalus. Apart from him stood Lady Pallas, a beautiful and accomplished elf woman who was a close friend and personal advisor to Athena, and Dalton, a portly man who acted as the court herald and the queen's personal helper. To the right of Athena's throne stood a man Achilles hadn't met before, but knew by reputation. He was well built and around 7 feet tall. His hair was black mixed with a lot of gray, and had a similar gritty beard. He was square-jawed, and his eyes looked angry. He wore iron boots and leather slacks along with a sleeveless bronze breastplate that showcased his large and muscular arms. Scars could be seen on his neck and hands, and it seemed there were more under his armor. Here his official title is the Champion of Athena, but he is better known around the world as Theseus, the Minotaur Slayer. A long blue carpet, which was luxuriously decorated with silver threads, was laid out from the entrance of the throne room to the podium on which Athena sat. The 8 commanding officers stood on either side of it. 4 commanders stood on each side of the carpet, according to the number of the legion they commanded. Odysseus, who held the title of general commander and leader of the first legion, stood closest to the goddess. Achilles only knew a few of the remaining commanders personally, like Icarus, but he knew that all of them were tested veterans on the battlefield. Even the leader of the 4th legion, Commander Leos, who was still greatly injured, was present and had half his body covered in a cast. After everyone was in position, the goddess ordered one of her guards to fetch their guests. A few minutes passed and no one uttered a word. The tension within the room seemed to even make the air heavier. Finally, the doors opened again and 2 men stepped inside. In the front was a man Achilles had met before, a long time ago during the years of the Trojan War. He was thin and sickly looking with a body that seemed to be just bones covered in skin. His gray hair was neatly combed to a side. His bony face had dark circles that made him look as though he hadn't slept in years. His lips curled into a thin smile that was more eerie than inviting. He wore an expensive gray suit along with a dark blue tie with tiny anchors printed on them, as if to show that he truly enjoyed the name ferryman. Walking beside the ferryman, behind him was a man Achilles did not know. He wore regular jeans with a bright orange t-shirt with the picture of a cartoonish cyclops sleeping on a hammock. His hair was black and unruly like he had just gotten out of bed, and he had a bored expression on his face. He also had a bag of salted poppy seeds in his hand which he was snacking on. He looked like he was in his 20s, but Achilles knew better. He could sense that the man was much older and much more dangerous than any other person in the room. "Ah, my goddess Athena, you look as radiant as ever," Charon said with an unnerving smile. "Skip the pleasantries, Charon." Athena replied coldly, "I know the messenger of the underworld did not come all this way to pay me compliments." Charon did not seem insulted by this. He seemed very used to this reaction. "Straight to business then. Well, my goddess, I understand you must be busy with the upcoming festival, so I'll get right to the point," Charon continued. "We would like to, that is to say Pluto, the empire of Lord Hades, would like to form an alliance with you." This was a surprise to say the least. Everyone in the room seemed confused by these words, and Achilles knew why. Throughout the ages, the gods had formed alliances and treaties with each other for various purposes, usually for trade or for extending their military support during a war. All the gods did this. All the gods, except Don Hades, that is. It is said that in the millennia since the Titan War, after the dawn of the New Age, the lands of Hades has never allied itself with anyone. Even Athena was at a loss for words. I do not understand," she said, perplexed. "Allies, I'm sure you are familiar with the concept," replied Charon. "We become partners, if you will, in terms of commerce, trade, and of course war." The whole council exchanged incredulous looks, but no one spoke a word. They all waited for Athena to speak again. "I am honored by your offer, but I do not understand the need for it. Our finances are stable and our reserves are well stocked," Athena said. "And as for my army, it is already quite a formidable force, as you may have noticed," she said, referring to her council around her. All of a sudden, the man next to Charon started laughing. He seemed to have finally gained interest in the conversation, and he pocketed the bag of poppy seeds he was snacking on. "Are you talking about these jokers?" He dared, looking around the room. "Please." He raised his hand, and with just a snap of his fingers, almost everyone in the room fell to the ground. Achilles felt it too, a force that was making him rather drowsy. But he still managed to hold on to his consciousness. He looked around to find that, other than the 2 visitors and Athena, only Odysseus, Theseus, and Daedalus were still standing. All the guards and even the other 7 commanders were on the floor. The man looked around to admire his handiwork and said, "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Hypnos, god of sleep, and one of the 5 capo regimes of Hades." "How dare you?" Athena shouted, outraged. "Don't worry, they're not dead. After all, death is my brother's business. I merely put them for a nap," said Hypnos. "As is evident, you can see your forces aren't as formidable as you think. Though I must say I didn't expect you to be standing, old man," he said, looking at Daedalus. "Oh, don't worry. I'm sure I would not pose a challenge to you, Hypnos. In my years as a scientist, I have realized that preparation is the key to survival. As part of such preparations, I have learned quite a few tricks to help me withstand such unexpected attacks." Daedalus replied with a smile. Hypnos seemed impressed by this. "Good for you. It was quite surprising, but not nearly as surprising as that," Charon said, looking straight at Achilles. Achilles was standing at the rear of the room, out of the line of sight. He was considering pretending to be unconscious, but it was too late. Charon had just caught him. Hypno stared at him and remarked, "If you're still standing after one of my sleep waves, you are grossly underpaid, my dear guard." "Oh, that's no ordinary guard, Hypnos," Charon declared. "It has been a long time, hasn't it, Achilles? Your metal leg is hard to hide." Achilles removed his helmet, walked up to Charon. "It's not been long enough, though," countered Achilles. Charon smirked at him. "Nice to see you haven't lost your arrogance. We creatures of the underworld are used to being unwelcome, but don't forget that the stench of the underworld is carried by you as well. The invincible armor you have is forged from it. That can never be hidden, even if you put it away in a crystal. I think it is best if you two catch up with each other some other time," said an annoyed voice. It was Theseus, and his glare conveyed that it was not a request. "My apologies, champion. Let us return to the business at hand," Charon said with a forced smile. "We will discuss nothing until you awaken my men," stated Athena. "I would prefer not to, my dear goddess," Charon said, sneering. "You see, the matters to be discussed are of a delicate sort." "I don't care," began Athena before Charon cut her off and said, "Tell me, goddess, I have heard that you have an amazing memory. If that is so, could you please read this letter and answer a question?" He took out a small piece of paper and handed it to Athena. She took it from him and began to read it. As she did, her eyes widened in disbelief. She stared at Charon, expecting an answer. "You recognize the handwriting?" he asked. "How did you?" "I thought she was dead," Athena whispered. "She's one of us now, a capo regime like me," Hypno said. "Yes, it was actually her idea to extend an alliance. Said we could trust you," Charon added. "No, why would she join hands with the underworld?" Athena demanded. Charon thought for a while. "I suppose when you make very powerful enemies, you start looking for allies in dark places. A piece of advice you should follow if you wish to protect the old inventor here," he said, throwing a glance at Daedalus. Achilles wasn't surprised that Charon knew about Daedalus being abducted. The underworld had its own ways of gaining information from the shadows. But what worried him was the talk of a mighty enemy. It seemed Charon knew exactly who Ares was working for. Athena had a grim expression on her face. "My loyalty lies with the Olympian Council," declared Athena. But Charon began to laugh, a sickening cackle of amusement. Now, Athena, we both know that's not true. Not since that incident with Themis," he reminded with a smirk. "Soon you might find it hard to keep up the pretense as your kingdom burns to ashes." "You dare speak such blasphemy," Theseus interjected. "But my dear champion, who better to speak blasphemy than the demons of the underworld?" continued Charon. "How dare the likes of you even mention Themis?" Athena roared, her eyes filled with rage. My, I seem to have touched a nerve," Charon remarked. "I did not mean to insult you, goddess, but merely spoke the truth. But it seems you need a bit of time to ponder over our offer. We shall be in the city for the festival. I do hope we can reach a favorable agreement before it ends." With those words, Charon started walking to the door, along with Hypnos, who had started munching on his poppy seeds again. As the doors shut behind them, everyone turned to Athena for an answer. Noticing that the others were slowly regaining consciousness, she cautioned, "Do not speak of this to anyone." She then strode out of the room, clutching the letter she had received, without waiting for her council to awaken. Achilles helped the others back to their feet. As per Athena's instructions, those who fell unconscious were only told that their guests were denied any discussion, since they had attacked the council and were made to leave immediately. While Odysseus spun a story to convince the others, Achilles was deep in thought. The conversation with the ferryman had just confirmed a suspicion he had, one he desperately wished was not true. Ares had quite a few inexcusable attributes to him, but being weak was not one of them. The war god was also not the type to take orders from someone whom he did not fear. Achilles had hoped that Ares was the biggest threat that they would have to deal with, but it was evident now that the situation was much worse. The Legions of Athena, Chapter 9. Another week had passed. Soon it was the eve of the festival. Maximus was training alone in the garden. Since the day he had contested against Rex, he had been spending most of his time training alone. He avoided Rex and the others deliberately, because he didn't want them to ask him any more questions. Questions to which he did not know the answer. The voice hadn't responded either. Every night, before he slept, he had tried contacting it, and each time he had been ignored. He was hoping to talk to Achilles about it, but for someone who was so keen on him entering the tournament, he wasn't really around to train him. In the past week, he had seen Achilles only once, for hardly 5 minutes to top it off. He had come by the day after the sparring session, and instructed him to continue with his training on his own. All he said was that something had come up, and that he would be leaving the city again. He said that he would return only by tomorrow, on the day the festival commenced. Maximus tried to focus all his energy into his training. This was proving to be hard, when he realized that the more he trained, the more he could confirm that something was different. He had tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination. He tried to believe that he had won against Rex due to the merits of his training alone. He tried to prove that by lifting weights, but he had definitely gotten stronger. He could lift a lot more than he had ever done in the army. But the real change he felt was that he wasn't getting tired. No matter how hard he trained or how much he sweated, he always seemed to have enough strength to keep going. It was as if his body had an unlimited supply of adrenaline running in him. He would be lying if he said he wasn't a tad excited by this. He had never felt stronger. He had never been faster or in better shape for that matter. But it still worried him. He knew that if a deal seemed too good true, then it probably wasn't. So he was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. There had to be a catch. He had stopped using his blade and shifted to a regular sword for his training. He had done it to see if his newfound strength only came with his blade, but he hadn't touched his blade in the previous 3 days. Yet there was no difference. The worst thing was, a part of him knew that this had nothing to do with the blade or the voice. Somehow the things the voice had revealed about his lineage kept coming back to him. But the only way he could confirm this was by talking to the stupid voice in his head, he thought to himself angrily, as he kept slashing away in the open garden. He seemed to have lost his concentration a bit there, as one of his strikes cut down a nearby shrub in half. He knew his mind was not focused on his training. Achilles had once told him, "There is no room for emotions in battle, only instinct." According to Achilles, the training was to make his blade a part of him, a part of his instinct. Getting distracted now would not help him in tomorrow's contest. Hedger had managed to find out the sequence of events of the festival. The Owlet's tournament would be held the day after the opening ceremony. Hedger and the others promised that they would help in any way that they could. However, Maximus decided it would be best to shut them out for now. He knew that they were worried for him, but somehow he wanted to be alone right now. He sat down on a nearby bench and drank some water to cool himself down. That's when he saw that a man was standing near a pillar next to the entrance of the garden, observing him. This was no longer unusual for him. In the past few days, quite a few passers-by had stopped to watch him train. Some had even went out of their way to shout insults at him, all of which he ignored. Even Elisha herself had come with her entourage just to stare at him with loathing, but he was not bothered. Whatever he wanted to say could be said at the tournament with his blade. He expected the man near the pillar to move away after a few minutes. Instead, he began walking towards him. The man started limping towards him. That's when he realized that he had seen this man before at the castle's infirmary. He was the other patient who had shared the sickbay with Maximus. The man seemed to have been restored to health since he had last seen him. He had fewer bandages covering him than before, but he was still limping and he looked extremely tired. The dark circles below his eyes suggested that he hadn't slept well for a while now. He came up to Maximus and said, "You are Maximus, correct? The challenger entering the tournament tomorrow." Maximus nodded to this. The man continued, "I am Commander Leos, the leader of the 4th Division of Athena. It is my Tyro you are replacing." Maximus was not expecting this, and he was at a complete loss as to what to say. "I'm sorry for your loss," Maximus said. "Don't be. It was war. I've lost soldiers before. Liam, that was his name. Bless his soul, was a great soldier and student, but even the greatest fall in battle. Sadly, I did not come here to mourn his passing." "What is it that you want then? Do you disapprove of me entering the tournament?" Maximus asked. Leos gave him a cheerless smile and replied, "Each of the 8 legions have specific roles within the army. The function of the 4th Division is the vanguard. This means that it's me and my men that hold the front line. Do you really think I have time to worry about some stupid tournament?" Maximus fell silent. He knew it was best not to answer. "No, I am here because of another reason," Leos continued. "Achilles has taken you under his wing, correct? That means he must have an enormous amount of trust in you." He then pulled a sealed envelope and handed it over to Maximus and directed, "Just make sure he gets this. I will be returning to the front lines in the evening." Maximus took the envelope from him and nodded. "But why? Hasn't Mars agreed to a ceasefire?" Maximus asked. "You are a Martian, are you not? You know how Ares operates. Are you naive enough to believe that someone like him will not be preparing for a counterattack the first chance he gets?" With these words, Commander Leos began limping away, leaving Maximus alone with his thoughts again. Night fell and Maximus was alone in his room again. He came back late on purpose after training to avoid his friends. He went straight to his room and shut the door. It was late at night, and Maximus was still tossing and turning. The thoughts of the tournament just kept him awake. The fact that he was not tired after such a rigorous workout wasn't helping either. Usually after training for so long, he would be out cold for hours, no matter what he was worried about. But now, thanks to his monstrous endurance, even that was impossible. As he lay there awake staring at the ceiling, his worry slowly started to turn to anger. He was annoyed by the way things were going. The surge of confidence he felt in fighting the Tyros had vanished a couple of days after his little scuffle with them. He was even more ticked off because something he could not explain was happening to his body. The only person who could help, his personal roommate in his skull, was now non-existent. Maximus shrugged at this thought. What if the voice really was a figment of his imagination? What if he was going crazy? With the unnatural strength and a voice in his dreams, he sure sounded crazy. No, that couldn't be, he told himself. The visions he received were spot on. There was no way he imagined that Ares' throne room and his conversation with his boss. Still, the voice hadn't spoken for so long, he began to wonder if he had disappeared for good, like Achilles had. That was the thing that angered him the most. his master Achilles. The man who was so keen on him entering this stupid tournament had wandered off, leaving him to train on his own. Having Achilles as his master was the only real advantage he had against the Tyros, a great deal of help that it did in the end. He was so angry at him. He had just left him at his time of need, using him as a messenger boy. His thoughts finally rested on the letter Leos had given him. He hadn't opened it, but all through the evening it preyed on his mind. He was curious as to what it contained. He wondered if it explained why Achilles was missing. He knew it would be wrong, but then again the commander had not specifically forbidden him from reading it either. He knew it was a weak loophole, but he was really fed up with not getting any answers. He lay awake for another hour or so till curiosity finally got the better of him. He ripped open the envelope and decided to deal with Achilles when it came to that. After all, his master had left him high and dry right before the tournament. This felt like a little payback. There was only a single piece of paper inside, a handwritten letter that said, "Achilles, I have looked into the situation we discussed earlier. It seems your instincts hold true. My men report that none of Mars's forces are present at the front line. Rather, as you surmised, reports show that the forces have not re-entered Mars either. It seems as we feared, Ares does not seem too keen on honoring his word regarding the truce. It is most likely that they are still within the outskirts of Minervian territory biding their time. My scouts cannot provide more information as heavy storms plague these regions now, leaving most of our scanners useless. In any case, I am departing to the front lines to get a better grasp of the situation. May the gods be with us. Destroy this letter. Leos." Just as Maximus finished reading the letter, bam! He felt a huge force hit him from nowhere, and he was unconscious on the floor. Maximus awoke again almost instantly, and his first instinct was to reach for his sword, but he couldn't find it. In fact, he was not even in room anymore. He was in a completely dark place. A place he'd been in, before in his dreams. He wasn't worried anymore, but he was a bit annoyed at the unexpected nap he was made to take. "So you finally decided to show up then?" he shouted. "Lower your voice, child," the voice said. As always, the words seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "You're a bit late, you know. I've been calling out every day," Max said. Yes, your pitiful worries about your own strength. Sadly, I have no time for that," the voice replied. Maximus was insulted by this. Pitiful? He had no idea what was happening to himself, and he had the right to be worried, but the voice found it pitiful. "Now listen here, you. Maximus couldn't think of a proper insult to place there. After all, what do you call something that's just a sound? Just listen," Maximus finished angrily. He had never regretted getting angry before, but now he did. The darkness quickly changed to a blinding light. A flash so strong he shut his eyes with pain. A flash so strong he was thrown back. He was thrown back by a light? That didn't even make sense. When he reopened his eyes, it was complete darkness again, and he was on the floor. Not that he could see the floor. He got back to his feet and didn't seem hurt, but his eyes still stung. "Now you listen, boy," the voice said. "I already know what you wish to ask, and the answer is no. I do not have anything to do with what is happening to you, but I do know why." Maximus didn't say anything. He just nodded to show he was calm and listening. "The changes you are experiencing is because the power that resides deep within you has slowly started seeping out, is providing you with energy, which in turn is making you stronger, faster, and more resilient. The power owing to my lineage." Maximus asked uncertainly. The voice answered, "It would seem so. In any case, it has existed within you from birth. The most logical explanation is that you inherited it, but as you are unaware of your parentage, I cannot explain further. But it appears that finally, this energy is able to be released due to your training. I've been training my whole life. So why now?" The voice let out an exasperated sound that was almost like a growl. Maximus didn't recognize it, but he knew it was annoyed. "I was referring to your other training. The one with the sword," the voice explained. "The training for the sword. The meditations and all that other inner will crap that Achilles was making him do to help control the sword's flow of energy. But he thought none of that was working. He was no closer to making his sword light up when he wanted it to, but now the voice was telling him that it was channeling his inner strength to upgrade his body. All this was starting to make Max's head hurt. "Boy, concentrate," the voice ordered. "I did not risk speaking to you again to clear your doubts. There is something much greater you must worry about. I have a message for Athena." Well, this is new, Maximus thought to himself. "You have a message for the goddess?" he asked. "But didn't you explicitly tell me to not reveal your existence to anyone?" "And that is still a priority," the voice emphasized. "But the situation is dangerously familiar for me to hold my tongue. It must be the fates that led me here to witness this." Maximus could not comprehend what was being said, but it was evident from the tone that the voice was dead serious. "So what's the message then?" he asked. The voice took a few seconds to answer. "Athens will fall." "What?" Maximus cried in shock. "You want me to tell the Queen of Athens a city that has been called impenetrable will fall? A city that is protected by the Aegis Wall and has been never breached in 1,000 years is vulnerable to attack? I'm sorry, but I'm going to need a bit more than that. It is not completely comprehensible to me as well, but the similarities are too strange to ignore, and I for one do not believe in coincidences," it said. Still not making a lot of sense here, big guy, Maximus persisted. A long time ago, so long ago that most have forgotten, a kingdom was reduced to ashes, and now by some cosmic coincidence it is happening again, the voice said. The signs are the same, the Treaty of Peace, an event that ensures that all the major leaders are in one place. And the final piece was revealed to me through your letter. Maximus was trying to make sense of the confusing information being disclosed to him. An event, he said. You mean the festival? And information from the letter. You mean how Ares' hasn't forces have not retreated? No, the voice responded. The weather. Maximus recalled the letter which mentioned heavy storms preventing further scouting. You think bad weather is the final sign? The storm is a lie, the voice said. It is merely a haze created to hide the forces within it. Maximus was not getting any of this. You think Ares is hiding his army inside the storm, but that's impossible. Hiding there would only weaken his troops. This was a fact Maximus knew very well firsthand. He had been stuck in bad storms during a mission while he was in the army. The weather proved to be an adversary on its own. The muddy terrain made transportation near impossible. The rains drenched the equipment, making it impossible to use. Not to mention the spread of diseases became very common as well. Any army that came out would be in no fighting condition. You do not understand. It is as I said before. The storm is a lie. Even though the rains and fog seem thick on the outside, the inside that is the very center of the storm is hollow, the voice elaborated. You mean it's like a donut? Max queried. I do not recognize that instrument, the voice replied. You've never had a... never mind. So it's like a well with the storm acting as its walls, deduced Maximus. Precisely, the voice replied. Maximus couldn't believe what he was hearing. But if all this was true, Ares and his forces were much closer to Athens than everyone assumed. Wait, there's still one thing you haven't considered. If what you said is true, why haven't they already attacked? All the Minervian commanders have been back for days now, Maximus asked. Perhaps they believed that attacking during the festival would be more advantageous, the voice answered. Maximus shook his head and said no way. Once the festival starts, Athens will be filled with countless tourists and even important ambassadors from other countries. Attacking then would mean risking making these countries enemies as well. Ares is not dumb enough to do that. The voice paused for a few seconds and said, I had not considered that. I am surprised though, child. You are not as ignorant as you present yourself to be. Isn't that just a fancy way of saying I'm not as dumb as I look, Maximus thought to himself. And if that is the case, then perhaps they are waiting for something else, the voice said. All this is under an assumption that Ares is able to control the weather, Maximus said skeptically. He might not be able to, child, but I am certain about the identity of his master, said the voice. Max's eyes widened. Did that mean the voice knew who was pulling Ares' strings? You know who Ares is working for? No answer. Come on, tell me, he shouted again. Still silence followed. Are you still there? He shouted into the darkness, hearing no reply but his echo. On the outskirts of Athens, just a few miles away from the city walls, a magnificent creature began to descend. The beast was pearl white and seemed to glow against the dark night sky. As it landed, it folded its pair of enormous wings and trotted to a stop on the grassy plains. It was a horse, a large, white, magnificent horse with wings that stretched out longer than its body. It was called the Pegasus. The Pegasus was much more than a flying horse. It was an immortal beast with great magical properties which was believed to have been uncontrollable for eons. That is, until the man riding on top of it came along and tamed it. But the taming of the great beast was not even close to the greatest feat he had accomplished. Once the Pegasus had come to a complete stop, the man stepped off it and let the creature feed on some well-deserved grass. A man was watching the entire scene unfold before him from atop a tiny hill. But this was no ordinary mortal, but Hermes, the messenger god. He had been waiting for the arrival of this man for a while. In a matter of seconds, Hermes had left the hill at an astounding speed and was now standing a few feet behind the man. As the man turned around, the messenger god said, "You're late, Perseus." Perseus greeted the god with a smirk. "What's the hurry, Hermes? Athens isn't going anywhere. You should have arrived days ago," Hermes pointed out, not really mad or surprised. He had known the hero for a while now, and punctuality was not one of his strengths, but he had dozens of other qualities to make up for it. "Arrive early. For what, mate?" Perseus said with a laugh. "The festival only starts tomorrow." "We were hoping to get the job done before the festival began, so as to avoid complications," Hermes said. Perseus turned and looked at the sky. He was extremely tall and perfectly built. His oval face bore strikingly handsome features. His dirty blonde hair was pushed back due to the flying, revealing his bright green eyes. His gaze was fixed at the far end of the sky. To the northwest of Athens, a massive storm was brewing. It looked like any other ordinary storm, but Perseus knew it housed things far worse than a few drops of rain. "Oh, but I want to see the festival. They are quite fun, you know," he said. "Besides, it seems you'll be getting what you want one way or the other." His gaze was still fixed on the storm. Hermes followed the hero's eyes and knew what he was talking about. "It is not about what I want, my friend, but what our benefactor wants," Hermes said. "But you are right. If you fail, then the storm reaches Athens. Perseus was not happy to hear this. Has he lost so much faith in me that I require a backup plan? Hermes almost laughed at hearing this. Oh, my dear Perseus, you misunderstand. You are the backup plan. Ares was not supposed to fail. What we have there is an ultimatum, he said as he eyed the storm. I've seen the war god's force, Perseus said. Athena won't be so easily subdued. It's going to take something extraordinary to take down the Aegis. Hermes wore a grim look on his face. You know as well as I do that he will find a way. Perseus threw a look of disgust at the messenger god. Do you think I want this? It might come as a surprise to you, but I'm quite fond of the world the way it is. Things are a lot more peaceful than before. Business is booming and everything I do is to keep it that way, Hermes insisted. The last thing I want is Athens to be reduced to ashes. He wants the old inventor alive, and if you don't deliver him, Ares will, and no one wants that, which is why you must not fail. Perseus went over to the Pegasus and mounted the beast. Before he took to the skies, he turned to Hermes and said with a smirk, Have I ever? The Legions of Athena. Chapter 10. Maximus walked towards the dining room, still very distracted from the conversation he had had last night with the voice. Athens will fall, the voice had told him. He knew that it was not a piece of information he should take lightly. As he entered the hall, he had to put these thoughts aside though, as Rex and Mia were already there eating. Ever since his sparring session against Rex, he hadn't had a real conversation with his friends, so an awkward silence followed as he sat down. Hey, he mumbled to them as he began to eat silently. A few minutes passed before, out of nowhere, wham, Rex just took a right swing to Max's shoulder. He fell out of his chair and landed face first on the floor. Mia gasped in surprise as well, and dropped her green goop-filled spoon. Maximus scrambled back to his feet furious and shouted, What the hell was that for? Ah, so it speaks, Rex joked. Listen here, you little numbskull. Just because you got lucky last time does not change the fact that I have beaten you more times than I can count. And more importantly, it does not change anything between us. Somehow, Max's anger didn't last after that. He knew Rex long enough to understand exactly what he meant by that. He knew what Rex meant was to quit worrying, and that they would be there for him, no matter what. But of course the hulking imbecile would never say those words. Instead, he would just punch him and talk crap. Gah, Max screamed. Punch me again and we'll have a recap of our last match right now. But as he sat down again, he couldn't wipe the stupid grin off his face. Are you guys sure you weren't in a mental asylum back in Mars? Mia said, rolling her eyes and taking Max's spoon. Hey, how am I supposed to eat then? You can have mine, which is lying on the floor. It's thanks to you geniuses I dropped it, Mia retorted. So take his, Max said, pointing at Rex, who had went back to gulping down the goop. No way. He's already slobbered all over it, Mia said. I wouldn't be surprised if he swallowed the thing by accident. Maximus looked down at his own goop and decided that he wasn't that hungry anyway. So Hedger's not up yet? He asked. Well, you won't believe it, but the past couple days that bird brain has been getting up early and heading to the library, Rex answered. Didn't know he was such a bookworm. Still, someone has to go get him because we'll be leaving soon. The opening ceremony for the festival is in the afternoon, informed Maximus. Well, since you're done eating, Mia hinted with a sheepish grin, and Maximus left for the library with a scowl to find Hedger. When Maximus entered the library, he didn't spot Hedger right away. His small body was hidden behind a large stack of books that easily concealed him. Hedger didn't even notice that he was there either. He was too busy staring at the computer monitor on his desk. So I zone out just for a few days, and you turn into a crazy hermit on a reading frenzy? Maximus joked. Hedger turned around and greeted him with a grin. Well, look who finally showed up. We were afraid that we were only going to get to see you when you got your ass handed to you by those tyros in the tournament tomorrow. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Max retorted, lightly punching the sprite. Then he pulled up a chair and sat next to Hedger and asked, So what's all this? This, Hedger said. This is history. Maximus gaped blankly at Hedger, who was busy rummaging through the pile of books. Finally, he took out an old, thick, brown book and handed it to his friend. Maximus thought the book looked vaguely familiar. Is this the book you found the other day? Hedger nodded. Max flipped through the book, and there was no doubt about it. It was the same handwritten copy they had found days earlier, when he was still obsessed with finding the origin of his sword. But while his obsession ended that day, Hedger seemed to have picked one up. So you figured out what this is? Maximus asked. Hedger scratched his head and said, Kind of. You remember how we thought it was a journal of some kind? Maximus nodded for him to continue. Well, we were right, only it belonged to someone old, and I'm talking someone who breathed during the old Titan War, Hedger said. What? No way. The year is 1232A. That means the Titan War ended around 1,200 years ago, right? Maximus asked. Hedger shook his head and said, Well, our current timeline, GA God's Age, didn't start right after the Titan Age ended. There were about 100 years or so during which the Titan War occurred. There's not a lot of info about what happened during the war. That is why I call them the Dark Ages. Only after the Dark Ages did the God's Age, that is 1 Gramne, begin. Anyway, this journal is dated to the time of the war, so its details and language are all messed up. Maximus let out a whistle and said, Looks like you've gotten yourself quite a hobby. So is that what you're searching on the computer now? Hedger turned to the screen and said, Nah, that ancient journal is nearly 1,000 pages long. Besides, they don't really let you take it out of this place. So I asked Daedalus, and he showed me how to make a digital copy using a machine at the back of this library. Once I was done with that, I thought why stop there and started making copies of other books I found interesting. The digital copies are on this computer right now. If they're on the computer here, how is that any better? Maximus asked. Hedger gave him a smirk and said, 'Cause I'm going to transfer them all to this little beauty right here. He handed Maximus an electronic device that looked like a thin slate that fit in his palm, but when he touched it, the device lit up. Is this a computer? Hedger replied, smiling. Well, kind of. Daedalus gave it to me as a replacement for that mobile I broke. Guess being clumsy paid off. This thing here's much more useful. Can call people on it too. It's called an e-reader. The e-reader didn't look anything like the old mobile, which had a numeric keypad and a small screen on it. This entire device seemed to be one big screen. It can do lots more. It's like a pocket-sized computer, really. It even has games and, more importantly, can read digital files. In fact, I'm transferring the data from the computer right now. Wirelessly. Can you believe that? Athenian tech is just incredible. Sounds useful, Max said as he handed the device back. But what books are you copying anyway? They had known each other for a long time and he had never seen Hedger read a great deal before. Anything that might become helpful to us later on. From plants and potions, a herbalist's handbook, to from a regular fleece to a golden one. A guide to starting a... Maximus laughed and asked, What do we need those for? Hedger looked at him seriously. The playfulness had left his eyes. You do know that we have to start a new life soon, don't you, Max? I mean, we can't just stay here forever. Maximus didn't know what to say to that. Between the tournament coming up and messages of impending doom from the voice, he had not really considered their next move. But he was glad that Hedger had and felt relieved that his friends weren't as short-sighted as himself. Well, in any case, it sounds like you could take a break. Now come on, Hedge, we have a festival to get to. There was no time that the city of Athens was more active or colorful than during the occasion of the Panathenea festival. Visitors from all over the world would gather to join in the festivities that marked the birth of the great Minervian capital. The streets of the city were filled with waves of people, of various races from numerous countries, all assembling to participate in the events of the festival. As Maximus and the others finally stepped out of the castle, onto the main streets, the first word that came to his mind was messy. Growing up in the barracks, Maximus was always used to a very systematic environment, with very strict commanding officers who ensured the place remained that way. When Maximus had first entered Athens, he had felt that the city would have made those officers jealous. The entire city was perfectly synchronized in every aspect. Not even a light bulb looked out of place, but all that seemed to have been tossed out of the window once the festival began. For one, there were people everywhere. The place was so overcrowded that he kept bumping into people every 10 steps, and it was loud. From an array of vehicles to vendors, a variety of street performers also littered the streets. It was hard to even hear one's own thoughts at the moment. Where should we go? Mia wondered. What? Max responded, not hearing clearly, as they were right next to an all-dwarf rock band called the Rolling Gnomes. Where to? She shouted this time. Maximus pointed to a large structure down the road, where Achilles had told him to meet up at, the Colosseum. The Colosseum was one of the largest structures present there by far. Towering above the rest of the street, the large circular stadium was capable of housing over 10,000 spectators effortlessly. It had over 20 entrances. As they got closer to the giant gray and bronze behemoth, they could see a strange blend of the past and the future. The outer walls of the Colosseum were sculpted with scenes depicting epic battles and other significant chunks of Athenian history. Right beside massive screens which shifted between news coverage from around the festival to a list of upcoming events and quite a few advertisements in between, Maximus and others headed towards Gate 11 through the unending sea of masses where Achilles had told them to meet. Once they reached the gate, the situation did not get any better. There were so many people around that it would be hard to find even an ogre, much less a man. Hedger took to the skies for a better vantage point with no real luck. But after a few minutes, Maximus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see a man in a familiar black hood staring down at him. He knew it was Achilles. It was the same attire he was wearing when they first met. He pointed to the gate and asked them to follow. Achilles had to show a pass at the gate to the centaur on security duty to let them in. It was at least a bit less crowded inside. Achilles did not stop. Instead, he kept walking. After a couple of hallways and a few flights of stairs, they reached an elevator. The 5 of them entered, and Achilles pressed the button for one of the topmost floors as the doors began to close. Once the elevator was in motion, Achilles removed his hood and greeted them. "Enjoying the festival?" he asked in his regular cold and distant tone. "Seeing as how we were constantly cramped between sweaty strangers, I might say that enjoying is not exactly the word," Mia said. "I'll say," added Hedger. "My tail got stepped on twice, and that was when I was gliding." Achilles remained as stone-faced as ever on hearing this. As the elevator doors opened, he put his hood back on and said, "I'm sure you will find the Colosseum more to your liking then." They stepped out. Maximus had to agree with his teacher already. For one thing, there were fewer people on this floor. Sure, it was still crowded, but not a suffocating mob like downstairs. Also, it was easy to see that this floor was classier. The open hall they were standing in had maroon walls with golden embroidery on it. There was a large structure in the middle, shaped like an arc with smiling attendants on one side. There were large ferns placed all along the room, with very comfy-looking couches. The whole area was also well air-conditioned, which really helped, as they had just came in from the scorching sun. There was even a large chandelier sparkling around them. Though Maximus didn't know personally, he imagined that this would be how the lobbies of five-star hotels looked like. Right then, he felt like he didn't belong there. But it wasn't because of the fancy lobby, it was because of its guests. It was easy to see that the people around came from a very different walk of life. It showed in the fancy clothes they wore, the way they walked, and even in the glares their little group was receiving. It was obvious that all the guests around them came from a much wealthier layer of the society. It made Maximus feel really self-conscious too. Their group were all dressed in the best street clothes they had. Still, he was pretty sure that everything they wore together cost lesser than the shoes of the old man in front of them. "Well, aren't we underdressed?" Hedger murmured. They all looked towards Achilles, unsure of their next move, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he walked over to one of the corridors leading out of the hall and said, "Wait here." Maximus considered following him. He still hadn't told Achilles about the voice's warning, nor had he given him the letter from Commander Leos, but he decided that now was not the time. Disclosing that the city they were standing in might be reduced to ashes seemed like a delicate topic that required a bit more privacy, Maximus thought to himself. So he decided to take a seat on one of the nearby couches with the others. "Am I the only one here who felt more comfortable downstairs in the suffocating crowd?" Hedger asked. "For once I agree with you," Rex said, shifting uncomfortably on the chair that was clearly too small for him. "Not exactly like the trenches, is it? This is the VIP section of the Colosseum. You know, the top floors. Those corridors lead to the best seats in the place," Mia said. Maximus nodded to this. "So this is like the VIP waiting room. Wonder if anyone famous is here." Mia pointed her head to the left and said, "There's someone noteworthy right there." Maximus realized that she was pointing to a group of 5 people. He had noticed them immediately on entry, mainly because it was the first time he was seeing the race in person. But he knew exactly what they were. They all stood at around 7 feet in height, with skin in different shades of blue and green. Their hair was a darker shade that also matched their respective skin colors. Out of their heads appeared webbed, frill-shaped ears. On either side of their necks were 3 horizontal slits that acted as gills. Their upper bodies were strong and muscular, and they had fins on their elbows. They also had webbed hands like those seen on frogs. Their lower halves were another story. 4 out of the 5 of them had long fishtails that were resting on personal transporters called hoverboards, a levitating slab of metal with handles like those of scooters, connected to it for steering. This was the only way most of these creatures could travel on land. After all, mermen belonged to the sea. "Are you talking about the mermen?" Hedger asked, and Mia nodded. "I'm going to take a wild guess here, and say the guy in the middle is who you're talking about, the one with the feet," Rex added. Out of the 5 mermen, one alone was not on a hoverboard. In fact, his lower half wasn't even a fishtail. Instead, he had 2 muscular legs covered in green armor made from coral. His skin was a dark shade of blue, and he wore a gold-encrusted coral helmet similar to his armor. In his left hand, he held a long bronze-hooked spear. On his right hand, he wore a massive gauntlet, shaped like a conch. "That's not Admiral Poseidon, is it?" Maximus asked. "What? Of course not, you idiot." Mia said, "You think one of the 3 most powerful gods would be just standing around like that? But he is Poseidon's general, isn't he?" Rex asked, narrowing his eyes. "Triton." Mia nodded to this. "Yep, that's Triton all right. One of the highest officers in the court of Atlantis. Atlantis was Poseidon's capital city, or more specifically, his capital island. Unlike the other gods, Poseidon's domain was not exactly land-based. Instead, he ruled over the Neptune Sea, which was easily the largest water body on the planet. He also maintained the various islands on it, as part of his territory. Of these, Atlantis was the largest. It was also widely known as the Sinking City. This was because the entire island of Atlantis acted as an enormous submarine. The island could be made to sink. It could even be made to move its position according to its needs. It is said that this was done purely by Admiral Poseidon's personal power. Maximus shuddered for a moment, imagining the might of a being that could move an entire island at will. "I gotta say, I'm surprised that Triton is here," Rex said. "From what I've heard, Athena and Poseidon are not on the best of terms." Mia nodded. "They aren't, but a treaty was signed between them a while back, so officially they are at peace. Guess Triton is here to keep up those appearances." "So you think the Admiral is here as well?" Hedger asked. "No way, a few nations send ambassadors to the festivals, but it's rare for the gods themselves to arrive in person." As they spoke, Triton and the other mermen moved away from the lobby, but the area was still filled with interesting characters. "Okay, so let me ask the most obvious question here," Hedger continued. "Why does he have feet? I mean, don't all the mermen and mermaids have dolphin tails?" Maximus was wondering the same thing when a new voice said, transformation magic. Two women had just approached them from their couch, and it was one of them who spoke. The shorter of the two, the one who had spoken, wore black robes with tiny golden flower designs creeping onto it. She wore ornamental rings on every finger, each with a different colored gemstone. Her hair was jet black, long and wild, with a couple of random braids, woven in golden strings. She had sharp features and a long nose. She looked like she was in her mid-30s and had a wide grin on her face. Maximus did not know who these women were, but Mia sure did. She jumped off her feet and hugged the lady who spoke and shouted, "Hecuba, I didn't expect to see you here." Then she turned to the second woman. With a nervous bow, she said, "Madam Hex." Madam Hex reacted to Mia with only a slight nod. She was slender and tall, very tall, in fact. She dwarfed Maximus and was easily as tall as Rex. She wore dark purple robes that covered every inch of her body. It was even draped over her head, forming a hood that covered her hair and half her face. Not that her face was visible anyway, as she also wore an ornate white mask with strands of gold and silver vines around its lips and eye holes. The only part of her body that was remained exposed were her hands. She had long, thin fingers and a single silver ring on the middle finger of left hand. The ring had an emblem of a pair of flaming torches forming an X. She also held a long, black furred rodent with yellow spots on it. Maximus recognized it as a polecat. He had even hunted a few of them back in the trenches, but had never seen one with yellow spots or quite this long. Or this unhappy, for that matter. The polecat seemed irritated and uneasy. It only seemed to get worse as Madam Hex began stroking it. "And I thought we were the weird ones here," Hedger mumbled to Max. Mia turned to them and said, "Guys, this is Hecuba and Madam Hex. They're members of the Hams division. Well, actually, Madam Hex here is the division head." Then she turned towards the two women and said, "These are my friends Max, Hedger, and Rex." They all gave the polite but awkward smile you give when being suddenly introduced to someone new. Hecuba gave a wide grin and Madam Hex nodded again. "Oh dear girl, you know how the Madam dislikes people calling it that," Hecuba said cheerfully. "But I do agree the High Athenian Magical Society is quite a mouthful. But all that aside, how are you, my dear?" "Can't complain," Mia said, "but I am surprised to see you here. Especially you, madam. Didn't think you were the festival type." Mia still sounded nervous while addressing Madam Hex, which Max found strange as Mia was not someone who got rattled easily. "Oh, she's not. But dear Athena always gets us great tickets, and I convinced her that it would be rather impolite to waste them. Besides, she could use a bit of time outside that tent we call HQ." Madam Hex seemed least bothered by the conversation going on, even though she was the topic of discussion. Instead, she was staring at Maximus with great intensity. Max was starting to get uncomfortable from the stare the purple-robed woman was giving him, and just when he thought it couldn't get any more awkward, the polecat jumped from Madam Hex's arms and started sniffing him. "I think he likes you," Hedger commented. The polecat turned and began to hiss at the sprite. "It's a she," Hecuba explained. "My apologies." Hedger said, unsure of why he was apologizing to an animal, but the polecat accepted it. She turned and began to sniff Maximus again, and then more specifically his sword. "Now, Gale, you know it's rude to sniff other people like that," Hecuba said, but Gale the polecat ignored her. Finally, Madam Hex had to move towards it, for the rodent to reluctantly jump back into her arms. But somehow, Madam Hex's gaze on him had still not shifted. A few moments later, Maximus finally saw Achilles approaching them, and was glad that this awkward conversation would be over soon. But just as Achilles reached them, the smile disappeared from Hecuba's face. Instead, her lips went tight, and her eyes were filled with loathing towards Achilles. "You," she spat out. It was clear from her tone that she knew exactly who was under the black hood. "My queen," Achilles responded respectfully, but Hecuba seemed to have transformed from the kind, smiling woman to someone in a feral rage. It might have been Max's imagination, but he was sure that even her nails were getting longer. "Do not address me such, you cur," she snarled. "I was a mother before I was a queen." Achilles stood there unresponsive to this insult, but Hecuba did not seem to be letting it go. "Enough," said Madam Hex. Her feminine voice had a very dense feel to it, and an unnaturally echoing tone as well. But that one word really was enough, as it seemed to have left Hecuba speechless. Finally, Hecuba calmed herself and turned away from Achilles and back to Mia with a forced smile. "Well, my dear, it really was lovely seeing you, but I'm afraid we must be going now, to find our seat." With that, the two strange women left along with their pet polecat, but even while leaving, Madam Hex turned to give Maximus one final look which sent a chill down his spine. Once they had departed, they all turned to Achilles expecting an explanation, but Achilles did not give any. Instead, he said, "Come on," and started walking down a corridor. As they were walking, when Max was sure Achilles was not within earshot, he asked Mia, "What was all that about?" Mia paused before responding and then said, "Well, a long time ago Hecuba used to be a queen, the queen of Troy to be precise, and the mother of Hector." And just like that, no further explanations were needed. They stopped before a set of huge double doors with the number 7 written on it. They entered to find a spacious and well-lit room. The room had the same maroon walls as the rest of the floor, and a few decorative vases and plants here and there. To the left side of the room, there was a large screen, and a state-of-the-art jukebox which was playing classical piano music. To the right side of the room was a table with an assortment of refreshments including snacks, a fully roasted lamb, and a bottle of champagne immersed in a bucket of ice. In the middle of the room were a set of 10 large and comfy-looking pushback chairs. Even Rex could easily fit into them. Soon all of them were facing the front of the room. There was a large opening where the front wall should have been. The floor extended out into a balcony a bit. There was a large glass window that took up the entire wall and gave the perfect view of the inside of the Colosseum. Maximus realized that they were in a private viewing box. He had no doubt it belonged to the person standing in front of them, Odysseus. He wasn't alone either. He seemed to be in a heated discussion with Icarus at the moment. "Do you expect me to greet him with flowers?" Icarus said angrily to the general. "I don't expect you to even look at him. In fact, I want you to stay as far away from him as possible. By the gods, Icarus, we cannot just refuse to host him because of your personal grudges." Icarus was about to keep arguing, but he had just seen all of the menor. Instead, he said, "As you wish, General Odysseus." Maximus imagined him gritting his teeth under his mask as he said this. "If you don't mind, then I will be leaving now, to be as far away from him as possible, according to your wish," Icarus said. Giving Achilles a slight nod, he headed to the door which slammed shut behind him. Odysseus finally turned to greet them. Achilles had taken off his hooded jacket. He turned to Odysseus with a questioning look. "Yes, I suppose you should know as well. We have a very special last-minute guest for the festival," Odysseus said grimly. "Apollo. Apollo, the sun god. The honor accorded to the ruler of the country of Sol, as well as the title of the sun god, was not enough to describe this particular entity. He was also the god of music, archery, poetry, prophecy, and much more. Often regarded as the very embodiment of perfection, he and his sister Artemis, the goddess of hunting, were said to be among Zeus's favorites. Maximus had heard a lot about the sun god while growing up, as he was not media shy. Maximus remembered Kayla once calling Apollo the god of hunks back in the trenches. It had made him unreasonably jealous at the time. Still, he had heard a few stories about Apollo recently, which greatly contradicted the sun god's public image. Not only had he burned Icarus in battle so badly that he now had to wear a full-body suit just to stay alive, but back in the Trojan War, it was the sun god who had shot Achilles on the heel, inflicting the wound that cost him his leg. But the world did not know this. According to history, it was Paris, a prince of Troy, who had made the shot and killed Achilles. Maximus knew that the only reason Apollo hadn't taken credit for this act was because Zeus had forbidden the gods from personally entering the war. But this also made Maximus wonder how Apollo could disobey the god-king's orders right under his nose. If Achilles felt any rage or frustration on hearing this news, he did not express it. He merely nodded to Odysseus and continued staring out of the window, looking out over the arena. Odysseus then turned to the others with a smile and said, "Well, welcome all of you. I rarely have guests in this humble abode. This is my private box in the Colosseum, box 7. Do make yourselves at home." "Perks of being general, huh?" Rex commented. Odysseus chuckled at this. "Oh yes. As general, I was allowed to choose any of the VIP boxes for myself. I chose number 7 as homage to my old brigade, the Omega 7. Odysseus left shortly after, as he had matters to attend to regarding the opening ceremony. Maximus decided that it was the perfect opportunity to hand over the letter Leos had given him, while others were busy stuffing themselves from the buffet. Achilles, on the other hand, had taken a seat already. So he quickly went over to Achilles and said, "I have something for you. It's from Commander Leos." He handed the letter over to Achilles, who read the letter immediately. He then took out his lighter and burned the piece of paper as instructed and closed his eyes to start meditating again. "I read the letter," Maximus blurted out, not sure on how else to start. Achilles opened his eyes and looked at him quizzically. "I know, I shouldn't have," Max blabbered. "But you were gone. I was confused and needed some answers." Achilles raised his hand to silence him. Then he asked, "And did you get your answers?" Though his teacher didn't sound mad, Maximus wished he did because he felt a bit ashamed for reading the letter. However, he reminded himself that he had something more important to say. "Look, I know I shouldn't have, but still. Well, when I read the letter, I had a vision." Maximus had already invented an explanation. The existence of the voice was still kept a secret from his friends, on its strict orders. A decision Max hoped wouldn't be a lapse in judgment in the long run. But for now, mysterious visions was what he was going with. Achilles seemed interested in this new information in any case. "What did you see?" he asked. "It was kind of hard to tell, but there was a storm, only it was hollow in a way, with the rains and winds avoiding the center. And I think that's where Ares' forces are hiding." Achilles seemed surprised by this. "Maximus, think clearly. Are you sure that is what you saw?" he persisted. Max nodded. "Something like that would require an enormous amount of magic, and Ares holds no power over weather manipulation," said Achilles. "Maybe one of his generals, then." "I've heard Deimos is quite a magician," Maximus speculated. "Deimos is an illusionist. He is nowhere near competent enough for something of this scale," Achilles replied. Maximus knew he was right. He had heard Deimos was a specialist in illusion and fire magic back in the barracks. Even he did not seem capable of creating a storm large enough to hide an entire army, but there was something peculiar in the expression on Achilles' face. "Do you know who could be responsible then?" Maximus asked. Achilles got up and headed for the door. Before he left, he turned to Maximus and said, "I have a hunch, but pray to whatever God is listening that my hunch is wrong." This has been a chapter from Book 2 of the New World Odyssey Series, The Legions of Athena. Links to the books in the bio. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next chapter.